friendly. They did have the offer for the game not to go ahead after the English FA suggested they could cancel the game, but all 23 players wanted the game to go ahead. Just like many sports stadiums across the world, the Wembley Arch will actually be lit up in the colours of the French flag to show solidarity with the French people. Elsewhere in sport, Lewis Hamilton says that he will work hard to try and understand why he's now losing to his Mercedes teammate Nico Rosberg. Nico Rosberg actually racked up his second victory against Hamilton in quick succession after winning the Brazilian Grand Prix yesterday, and Andy Murray begins his ATP Tour World Finals campaign against David Ferrer this afternoon. It will be interesting to see how Murray gets on, of course, because he's actually been preparing for the Davis Cup final, which starts next week on clay, but this surface is obviously the hard court, so it will be interesting to see whether he can step up to that challenge. We'll hear from Murray himself at 10 a.m.
Thank you very much, Jess. It's at 9:35. Welcome to the programme. Inevitably, a programme today dominated by events in Paris at the weekend. Let's go live now to the capital. Ben Brown is there for us. Ben, tell us more about what the French Prime Minister has been saying this morning.
Yeah, Manuel Valls has been saying, Victoria, that we have to live with this terrorist threat. We have to fully live, but live with this threat. And I think that's the message that people here in Paris and around France are beginning to get, because they had the attacks, the Charlie Hebdo killings at the beginning of this year in January, and all the terror that followed those. And then the year now is ending with more terrorism, even more deadly. Manuel Valls also said Islamic State cannot win this war against us, but this terrorist organisation is seeking to weaken and divide us. And here in Place de la République, where we are, right in the heart of Paris, is where people have been coming not only to lay flowers and light candles in memory of the dead, but also to leave slogans saying that France won't be weakened and it won't be divided by this terrorism, and that it will stand up to it and defy it.
What more can you tell us about the identity of the attackers?
Well, interesting, Victoria, because new details have just emerged in the last few minutes about two of the suicide bombers. So one of them, who blew himself up outside the stadium where President Hollande was during that France-Germany friendly match, the Stade de France, this was Ahmed Al-Mohammed, and a Syrian passport was found by his body. If that is authentic, he was 25 years old and born in Syria. So we're just getting that information right now from the Paris prosecutor's office. And the other identity of one of the other suicide bombers the prosecutor's office has also given us is Sami Amimour, who's a 28-year-old from Drancy in France. Now, this is very interesting and very significant, because this is a man who was born in Paris and who was known to the French intelligence services, we're hearing. He was actually placed under formal investigation in October 2012 for terrorist conspiracy. So he was right on their radar. And then he broke bail in 2013, and an international arrest warrant was issued for him. So three of his relatives have now been detained, but this is a man who was on the radar of French intelligence. So yet more questions for them.
And how would you describe, Ben, the atmosphere today?
Still very tense, Victoria. It's funny, we arrived here on Saturday morning. The city was pretty empty. People just in the few hours after the attacks, really frightened, nervous, staying in their homes, afraid to go out onto the streets. Then yesterday, more people did come out onto the streets, and they did want to attend vigils at the various scenes of the 6 attacks, light candles, lay flowers, show solidarity. But then there was panic last night when people thought there had been a new attack right here where we are in Place de la République, and people started running, hundreds of people running. They thought for their lives. People are so on edge, really, and there wasn't any gunfire, but they had heard rumours that there had been some sort of shooting, so they ran. There were extraordinary scenes in cafes where people were diving under tables, lying on the floor, because they thought new attacks had started, and particularly because there is one of the suspects still on the run, 26-year-old Salah Abdeslam. And police have said that he is dangerous and he should not be approached if he's seen. So I think that has added to the sense of nervousness and tension here.
Thank you very much, Ben, for the moment. Ben Brown, who is live in Paris. It's probably just worth repeating what the Paris prosecutor is telling us this morning about two of the suicide bombers. As Ben was saying, 28-year-old Frenchman Sami Amamor, charged in a terrorism investigation back in 2012 and had been placed under judicial supervision, but apparently dropped off the radar and was the subject of an international arrest warrant. And then another of the suicide bombers who blew himself up outside the Stade de France, tried to get in, found with a Syrian passport the name of Ahmad al-Mohammed. He was 25. Born in Syria. The prosecutor's office saying fingerprints from the attacker match those of someone who passed through Greece in October. And 3 members of the family have been in custody since early Monday morning. The very first attacker to be formally identified, though, was Omar Mostafai, a 29-year-old Frenchman born in the town of Courcouronnes, 15 miles south of Paris. And our reporter James Longman has been finding out more about him.
I'm in Chartres, which is a town about an hour's south of Paris, and we're outside the house of Omar Mostafai. Now, it's here that he lived in around 2012, but we've been on the trail of this guy all day. It started when we were in Courcouronnes, which is the town just south of Paris, about 15 kilometers south and part of the banlieue. I spoke to people there, and they kind of painted a picture of a bit of a street rat, a bit of a kind of a local small-time gangster, if you like, arrested 8 times by the police, involved in petty crime. But I spoke to a friend of his who said that he was a nice guy, just one of the lads, used to drive around in cars and just sort of generally kind of hang out, nothing particularly menacing about him at all. But something seems to have happened in 2010 when he came here to Chartres, and he was flagged by the government as a possible radical. In 2012, his brother at least thinks that he may well have gone to Algeria, and from there, possible that he even went to Syria, but I've got to say that's not been confirmed just yet. We've been on the trail of this young man, and it seems that it's gone from street rat to dangerous radical.
James Longman reporting. Still to come on the programme, we'll be live in Paris, obviously, where we'll get political reaction to the terror attacks. Let's talk now, though, to our political guru Norman Smith about reaction here, and in particular what David Cameron has been saying on the radio this morning. Norman, what would you draw from what he said?
A number of interesting lines. I mean, I suppose the most striking thing is Mr. Cameron said there'd been something like 7 thwarted terrorist plots in the UK in the past 6 months alone. Now, he said they're not on the scale of what happened in Paris, but obviously 7 is an awful lot in the past 6 months, and that underlines sort of the nature of the threat we now seem to face. He also announced there's going to be a beefing up in the security services, so there'll be extra cash to take on around 2,000 more spies, bluntly. The budget for aviation security is going to be double, so there'll be more security officers at airport, there'll be more scanning, there'll be more research for technology to go into scanning equipment, and there's going to be a review of a number of airports in predominantly the Middle East and North Africa, which are used by a lot of British travellers, just to see if the security there is up to date. And on top of all that, you know, the investigatory powers bill, which we've talked a lot about giving the security services more power to look at our emails, our internet, our data usage. There are indications Mr. Cameron may seek to speed that up through the Commons. But, you know, I guess what is absolutely critical and will be in many people's minds is, are we going to bomb? Are we going to join in the airstrikes against IS in Syria? The indications from Mr. Cameron this morning is no, not now. Why? Because there simply is no parliamentary majority for it. Most Labour MPs are opposed, the SNP are opposed, the Liberal Democrats are opposed. But here's the thing, Vic, there are signs that the West, Britain, America and France are willing to strike a deal with President Putin because the language has changed. And if a deal can be done with Putin so that Russia focuses all its efforts on attacking IS, but all its diplomatic efforts there, then that potentially could mean some Labour MPs would think, OK, we've got a sort of diplomatic route. We'll be willing to support military action if there was a diplomatic route. But just have a listen to what David Cameron said on the wireless this morning about relations with Russia. And, you know, it sounds much, much more conciliatory. Have a listen.
Well, of course, we are using our military hard power in Iraq, directly combating ISIL, and they've lost about 25 to 30% of the territory that they held. We're also using our hard military power to stop in their tracks threats to this country, as we did with Khan and Hussein, and indeed helping the Americans with so-called Jihadi John, who all were in Syria.
But you want to
Obviously,
extend
on
it
this
to
issue,
Syria now, the airstrikes?
on the issue of going further, look, I support the action in Syria. We're part of the enablers for that. It's happening anyway. The question is, should we go further and join that action? I've always said I think that it's sensible that we should. ISIL don't recognise a border between Iraq and Syria, and neither should we. But I need to build the argument. I need to take it to Parliament. I need to convince more people. We won't hold that vote unless we can see that Parliament would endorse that action, because to fail on this would be damaging. It's not a question of damaging the government. It's a question of not damaging our country and its reputation in the world. So I will build the case, but in the end, Parliament must decide.
So, Vic, this is where we are on airstrikes and whether we will join in. In the immediate future, no, because there is no Commons majority. Mr Cameron is absolutely not going to risk it, not just because of the personal blow to his own authority, but because of the diplomatic ramifications. It would be a propaganda coup for Islamic State. But I think the view in government circles is that if they can get Putin on board, if some sort of broader agreement can be reached, then he can go back to the Commons and say, look, I want you to support airstrikes, but I have got a diplomatic plan too, because many Labour MPs are saying, look, we're not going to support airstrikes unless there is a clear diplomatic plan. If David Cameron and President Obama can hammer out a diplomatic plan, then I think it is quite possible Mr Cameron will come back to the Commons and say, look, here it is, now will you back airstrikes?
I think a lot of people watching will be asking, could what happened in Paris happen here? And David Cameron addressed that this morning, and he said yes, but there are differences because we're an island.
Yeah, I mean, let's not underestimate, that is a fairly significant factor. When you talk to the police, they also say the availability of guns in Britain is much less, particularly automatic weapons. So that too is a restraining factor. The third restraining factor, which Mr Cameron talked about today, is the fact that we have different border controls to the rest of Europe. They have what's called the Schengen Agreement, which means basically in the rest of Europe, once you're in, but we still have our own border control, so we have an additional layer of security. But let's not be naive about this. We have seen terrorism on our streets already, very obviously, with 7/7 and Lee Rigby, and we should expect to see, there will be more police on the streets, there will be more police presence at big sporting events, such as this week's football match between England and France at airports. And I wonder too whether the Chancellor, George Osborne, is now going to have to think again about cuts to police budgets, because you can imagine the Home Secretary will be saying to him, hang on a sec, George, hang on. You cannot seriously be talking about cutting police numbers when we're facing this sort of terrorist threat.
Norman, for the moment, thank you very much. As you can imagine, we're getting more details all the time of some of the suicide bombers who were involved in the attacks on Friday night. The French authorities identifying two more of the attackers who have killed 129 people so far. And it's confirmed now that one of the men crossed from Turkey to Greece early last month. This was the man who blew himself up at the Stade de France, Ahmed Al-Mohamed. Found with a Syrian passport alongside him. Still not clear if that passport was genuine or not. And his family are saying that he went to Syria 2 years ago. That is the family of Sami Amamor saying that he went to Syria 2 years ago. More information coming in all the time. As soon as it comes in, we will bring that to you, of course. Let's talk now to Nabila Ramdani, who is a French-Algerian journalist, columnist, broadcaster, who specialises in French politics, Islamic affairs and the Arab world, and who is living in London. Hello to you.
Hello.
First of all, how do you respond to what happened on Friday in the capital of your country?
Well, let's be perfectly honest. My first thought was that I was glad I wasn't there. I live in London most of the time, but I do go back and forth an awful lot. My family is still there. My parents, my sister, my brothers, my friends live in Paris. And the first reaction was to say, thank God, I am in London and I am safe. But I also make sure to call family members and friends to make sure that they were not, caught in this tragedy. And in fact, I spoke to my sister and she said to me that she was about to go out with girlfriends around that time in the Bastille area. and they got lazy about it, and they remained, away from the capital city. But I also called my younger brother, who lives in Paris, and told him to stay at home, because there was no indication at that point that, the attacks were over by any means. There could be further attacks, and as it happens, there is an ongoing crisis still with, one of the terrorists at large with accomplices. So it's very much an ongoing threat. And I wanted to make sure that he's a distinctive-looking Arab young man, let's be honest about it. And there's always going to be a risk of him either being arrested or indeed be the victim of violence because of retaliation attacks.
Right. That's interesting that you talk about retaliation. Is that an inevitability, do you think?
Well, I think there's always going to be people who would want to link the Friday the 13th attacks and, try to stigmatize entire communities because of the background of the perpetrators of the attacks. And to give you some staggering figures, after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, within hours of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, there were already arson and indeed grenade attacks against mosques in France. In the 6 months following the Charlie Hebdo attacks, physical assaults against Muslims have increased by 500%. There was also an increase of 100% of verbal abuse against Muslims. Women wearing headscarves were particularly targeted, including children who refused to, do the minute silence in classrooms for the attacks, because they didn't particularly felt they were with Charlie Hebdo. On that case, they felt they were not Charlie. They were plucked out of classrooms and taken to police stations for interrogation. And we're talking about children aged from 8 to 12 years old.
But this feels different, don't you think?
It does. It does feel very different because of the nature of the attacks. It was very much indiscriminate, rather particularly sinister because of the targets. It's very easy to go about and attack unarmed civilians with gunfire and indeed grenades. And the very nature of the attacks makes it the most cowardly attack possible. And I think there will be a different feel to Paris. There is, of course, a determination to put a resilient front and to say never again. But we heard that slogan back in January with marches across Paris. And it was highly symbolic, it was necessary. But I think the French would now expect more than tokenistic marches or indeed slogans, or indeed tokenistic police presence on the streets. They expect the government to do much more than that, and that includes, intelligence, proper intelligence on the ground.
Let me ask you about some of the information that is coming out this morning, that one of the men, Sami Amamor, went to Syria a couple of years ago, and in fact was certainly on the radar of the authorities because he was under judicial supervision until 2013 and then somehow dropped off the radar.
Well, indeed. There is something depressingly familiar and indeed predictable about the profile of the terrorists, not only those involved in these attacks, but also, as we've seen with the Charlie Hebdo attacks. Invariably, they tend to be young French men of North African background who live on housing estates, so very much deprived areas. They tend to come from troubled backgrounds as well, involved in petty criminality, not particularly religious, but also with a track record of radicalization, which also at times includes spending time abroad, including in devastated countries like Syria or Iraq, or in any case countries where they can have an affiliation with organizations like ISIS or Al-Qaeda.
There is still a heck of a leap, isn't there, from growing up in a deprived suburb of Paris and then 15, 20 years later turning up with a suicide vest and a Kalashnikov to kill Muslims, Christians, French people, Algerian people, British people, Americans at a rock concert, for example.
There is indeed, but I think there are also there are clues that you cannot ignore, and that includes the radicalization aspect. Once the police, again, invariably, these young people are known to the security services. They often have spent time in prison, so they're on and off prison most of the time. But I think the radicalization aspect makes them particularly interesting for the security services, as in, people who should be monitored properly, and indeed trips abroad to countries like Syria, for example. That is not innocent. And dare I say, it takes a handful of sociopaths from that background to absolutely wreak havoc. These are people who, in their mind, their view, have nothing to lose. And there's a tacit agreement that they are prepared to kill as many people as possible, and they are prepared to die themselves. And may I just add as well that after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, we've heard from the Prime Minister of France, Manuel Valls. He spoke very frankly and bluntly about an ethnic, territorial and social apartheid in France. He spoke about the banlieue, the high-rise estates, characterized by delinquency, discrimination, and indeed poverty, which is a fertile ground for fertile territory for people who can become liable to carry out
vulnerable to radicalisation.
Just
to say, your French Interior Minister Bernard Cazeneuve is about to hold a press conference in Paris. We will cross to that live when he begins. Why do you think Paris again? What are your thoughts on that?
To be perfectly honest, if you, I'm sure there are many reasons, but there is also an intrinsic link, it seems, between foreign policy and domestic affairs. And there is certainly a relation there between France's decision to tackle an extremely serious problem, a global problem that is barbaric, radicalism linked to groups like ISIS and, carrying strikes in their territory in eastern Syria and western Iraq, and indeed, the perception that it is an unjust crusade, as it were, and it is yet another attack on Muslim countries. And that in itself, we know that groups like ISIS have mastered the art of communication, and they can certainly use that as a propaganda tool and to recruit vulnerable minds.
Thank you very much for talking to us. Thank you. Nabila Ramdani, who's a French journalist living in London. This news just coming into us, and it's from a source in David Cameron's office at number 10. Britain foiled an attack on the UK in the last month, according to a source in David Cameron's office. In the last minute, Britain foiled an attack on Britain in the last month. British authorities foiled an attack on the UK in the last month, that being reported by Reuters. Obviously, people will be asking more questions about that. When we have more answers, we will bring them to you. We're going to talk now to people living in France, because it's not only the global effort going on to identify the attackers, but also their network of collaborators. And as that process takes place, some community leaders in Paris have said they fear a tsunami of hatred towards French Muslims. There are around 5 million Muslims living in France, many of them in the suburbs, as we've just been discussing. Let's talk now to Samia Hatroubi from the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. Thank you for talking to us. I wonder, is a backlash inevitable, do you think, against some Muslims living in Paris?
Thank you for your invitation. So yes, of course, we are fearing some backlashes for the Muslim communities. And honestly speaking, while we are talking today, we have already witnessed some anti-Muslim rally in the north of France. We have seen mosque that has been tagged by racist sentences in front of the mosque. So yes, of course, we are fearing Muslim backlash but at the same time, I think we need also to bring a new narrative into the society, saying that we have failed to answer the Charlie Hebdo attack. We have failed to bring solution on long-term solution in terms of foreign policy, in terms of domestic affairs. And we need to bring back those issues into the table of politicians and ask them and demand some real solution on those topics.
Well, in terms of foreign policy, what do you think of your president's response overnight, which is to send more French jets to drop bombs on so-called Islamic State's stronghold in Raqqa in Syria?
I wake up this morning and I've seen this news and I was taken aback. Do we really think that sending weapons and bombing a city like Raqqa, we're gonna solve our issue? We know too far that the terrorist attack happened by people who were French and were born and raised in this country. I don't think that bombing Daesh is the solution to bring about peace in Syria. I don't think that it is right to bomb Daesh and not think about the genocide that happened because of Assad, because of Bashar al-Assad. I think we also need to ponder over how foreign policy and see where we failed, because we failed.
Thank you very much for talking to us. Thank you. That's Samia Hatroubi from the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, live in Paris. This reported by Associated Press. This is the latest on the attacks in Paris. A French official says the suspected mastermind of the Paris attacks was also linked to thwarted train and church attacks. They've identified the mastermind as a Belgian man called Abdelhamid Aboud, and they say he is believed to be linked to various thwarted attacks on a Paris-bound high-speed train and a Paris church. The official who has direct knowledge of the investigation, we're told, was not authorised to be publicly identified about speaking on the ongoing investigation. But the suspected mastermind, where it's being reported, is a Belgian man called Abdelhamid Aboud, believed to be linked to thwarted attacks on a Paris-bound high-speed train and a Paris church. At the moment, 7 people are in custody in Belgium, suspected of links to the attacks on Friday night, and an international arrest warrant has been issued for a Belgian-born Frenchman believed to be involved as well, who is still at large. It's 10 o'clock. Let's bring you all the weather, and here is Steph.
Victoria, thank you very much. We saw a lot of rain in the last 48 hours, primarily affecting northern England, North Wales, parts of southwest Scotland. And weather watchers have been sending some dramatic footage of rivers breaking their banks, cars submerged, and general lot of flooding across northern areas. This picture here of York showing the River Ouse at very high levels. And the bad news is we've got more wet and windy weather throughout this week with that chance of flooding. But then later on in the week, something a bit colder with some wintry showers. That's a long way off. I'll go back to the here and now. For Monday, it's a breezy day, windy across northern areas with severe gales developing across northern Scotland through the afternoon. Throughout, showers will be wintry over the Scottish mountain tops, rain to lower levels, but a cold feel to things across the northern half of the country, quite mild across the south. But here comes the next area of low pressure, which will bring wet and windy weather to much of England and Wales, including areas which have already seen flooding across northern parts. That's a deep storm there, bringing the severe gales will slowly move away, and both systems will clear away. We say hello to the next area of low pressure, which will be hurtling into southwestern parts of the country through the course of Tuesday, bringing yet another round of wet and windy weather, again in areas where we really don't need any more rain. Temperatures again on the mild side across the southern half of the country, quite chilly though across the north, with temperatures here in single figures. And then as we head on in towards the middle parts of the week, we see the next area of low pressure moving in. This one has a sting in its tail. It'll bring severe gales to Wales and England as it moves away. Brief ridge of high pressure, but then here's this next area of low pressure I was talking about to bring another round of wet and windy weather. So keep tuned to the weather forecast and go online as well to keep up to date with the flood and weather warnings.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's Monday. It's 10 o'clock. I'm Victoria Derbyshire. Welcome to our programme if you've just joined us. This morning, standing in solidarity, people across Europe will fall silent in an hour's time, pausing for a minute to remember the victims of the Paris terror attacks.
I remember just turning around to see where the sound came from, and as I turned around, everyone was just like row after row, just dropping to the floor. And so we followed suit, and then I remember looking up from the floor for a second and seeing just this guy walking around the edge of the room with a rifle.
Meanwhile, 7 of the Paris attackers are identified as the manhunt for an 8th continues. Police carry airstrikes over Raqqa in Syria, the stronghold of so-called Islamic State. Here, the UK ramps up its security response to the attacks. The government reveals 7 terror attacks were foiled in the UK in the last 6 months, 1 in the last month. Good morning. The main news so far this morning. Manhunt is underway for one of the key suspects of the Paris terror attacks, in which 129 people were killed. Police are searching for Brussels-born 26-year-old Salah Abdeslam. It's emerged that he was questioned in the hours afterwards, but then let go. 2 more of the attackers have been named this morning. One was Sami Amamor. He was born in France, and the authorities were already looking for him after he broke bail in 2013 on terror-related charges. And also Ahmad al-Mohammed, a Syrian passport was found near his body. In the last few minutes, a French official identified the suspected mastermind of the Paris attacks as a Belgian man called Abdelhamid Aboud. French police have carried out more than 150 raids across the country since Friday night. Several people have been arrested and weapons have been seized. The French Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, says the Paris attacks were being planned from Syria and more were being prepared.
We know that operations were being prepared and are still being prepared, not only against France, but other European countries too. Islamic State statement issued on Saturday, in which it claimed responsibility for the attacks, stated clearly that these countries were its possible targets.
France has hit back against the Islamic State militant group in response to the attacks, launching airstrikes against their stronghold in the Syrian city of Raqqa. The Defence Ministry said 20 bombs were dropped in the raid overnight, hitting targets including a command centre, a munitions depot and a training camp. It's emerged that Britain prevented an attack on the UK last month, according to government sources. It comes as more money is to be made available for the security agencies MI5, MI6 and GCHQ. David Cameron says an extra 1,900 officers would help in what he called a generational struggle against extremism. The Prime Minister also told Radio 4 this morning that Britain should consider joining airstrikes on Syria.
I support the action in Syria. We're part of the enablers for that. It's happening anyway. The question is, should we go further and join that action? I've always said I think that it's sensible that we should. ISIL don't recognize a border between Iraq and Syria, and neither should we. But I need to build the argument. I need to take it to Parliament. I need to convince more people. We won't hold that vote unless we can see that Parliament would endorse that action.
A 16-year-old has been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder after a police officer was attacked in East London. The officer was stabbed in the stomach while responding to reports of antisocial behaviour in Tower Hamlets. Scotland Yard said the constable is in a serious but stable condition. Around 60 flood warnings remain in place across Britain this morning, but the most serious risk is believed to have passed. Torrential rain over the weekend has caused flooding in parts of Cumbria, Lancashire and Yorkshire. Those are the main news stories so far this morning. Time for all the sport. Here's Jess.
Yes, thank you, Victoria. The French national team travelled to England today after turning down an offer to withdraw from tomorrow's friendly at Wembley following the attacks in Paris. Like many sports stadiums around the world, the Wembley Arch will be lit up in the colours of the French flag to show support for the French people. Mercedes driver Nico Rosberg beat his teammate Lewis Hamilton for the second time in a row, winning the Brazilian Grand Prix yesterday. Rosberg started on pole, led at the first corner and controlled the race from there. Hamilton, of course, sealed the championship title last month. And Andy Murray begins his ATP World Finals campaign later today. He faces David Ferrer at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Murray hasn't had the ideal preparation for this event, though. The world number 2 is also looking ahead to the Davis Cup final against Belgium and face the challenge of having to train for 2 different services. And that's all the sport for now. Back to you, Victoria.
Thank you. Let's go live to France then, because the French Interior Minister has just begun a press conference there.
Whose presence on our soil would have represented threat against our country.
J'ai par ailleurs déjà prononcé 6 déchéances de la nationalité française. 34 arrêtés
I have announced
ont été pris à l'encontre
that 6 French citizens have been identified. 34 were prevented from leaving the country, and including the imams, the preachers of hate. For months now, the services of the Interior Ministry have gathered the necessary means and measures in the cultural centers and also locations of faith to prevent this. The procedure is underway, and they will be examined by the Council of Ministers, these measures. The judicial framework installed by within the state of emergency will allow us to amplify this work in the long term to prevent attacks and protect French citizens. I have asked for an exceptional mobilization within the scope of a state of emergency measures so that to carry out research, search of household and homes. Over the past 48 hours, 100 targets have been identified, individuals have been identified over the past few nights. Last night, the police and gendarme, in coordination with our gendarmerie and territorial services, have carried out 68 searches of individual houses suspect for various accusations. This will speed up, and this is important and essential, our investigations over the radicalized objectives, and also to give us the information. The state of emergency is being applied. The searches were in Toulouse, Lyon, and all throughout the agglomeration of France. Not a single territory of the Republic will be neglected or left alone within a maximum alert, where the forces of the law are mobilized within my authority. I would like to give the first 24 individuals have been detained, 38 arms of various 18 drugs and stupefacants have been found. We have also found mobile phones and telecommunication means which would have been used. For example, an object have been identified that have been used for the trafficking of arms and drugs. We have managed to find a Kalashnikov, 3 automatic pistols, and anti-bullet vests under the direction of the Republic's prosecutor and within the judicial. We have orders to search the household of a number of people. We found a number of automatic pistols and military uniforms and rocket launchers. The judiciary police is carrying out its investigation as we speak. As you know, there could be a connection, a link between bandits and terrorists. All the elements gathered last night will be studied with regard to the terrorist link. This is just the beginning. These actions will continue. The reply of the Republic will be solid and total. Those who want to hurt the Republic, they will be attacked, they will be dealt with, and those who help them. Therefore, as the Prime Minister had reminded us this morning, we are deploying all the legal means and investigation means to expel the radical imams who preach hatred or to put under house arrest those who have been targeted. Ladies and gentlemen, faced with terrorist barbarism that has opened a war against us, there aren't any other options except one. This is the one that the French have adopted, and the French government is applying implacable response from the Republic against those who wish to destroy us. The terrorists will never destroy the Republic, because the Republic will destroy them. Thank you.
That's the French Interior Minister Bernard Cazeneuve. Various details about the identities of the suicide bombers, talked about 68 searches of suspects' houses going on across France, talked about the kind of weapons and ammunition that has already been seized, including pistols and rocket launchers. Downing Street sources are saying that security services prevented one attack in the UK in the last month. And earlier today, the Prime Minister said that 7 attacks were prevented in Britain in the last 6 months. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner is here. Would that be sort of pretty typical for what's being thwarted?
Well, the number of attacks that they are thwarting is far higher this year than it's been in the past. So, I mean, it's right back to the intense period around 2005, 2006, possibly even worse. They are arresting one person on average every day on suspicion of terrorism offences, which is really alarming. So the pace of investigations, the pace of arrests, the pace of threats is unprecedented. The scale of the thwarted attacks that David Cameron referred to there is tiny compared to what's happened in Paris. They would still be damaging. It's still, if those attacks had gone through, I'm sure, it would have been very bad for anybody involved, but they're not on the scale of Paris. Nothing that we have seen here, apart from 7/7, is on quite that scale. There was the liquid bomb plot, which was huge, but these were relatively minor. And I think that the intelligence agencies in Britain and probably the other countries had possibly lulled themselves into the idea that the most likely threat is going to come from some lone operators, people like the people who attack Lee Rigby in the streets of Woolwich, who are just going to be sort of radicalised, yes, but not particularly on a watch list, and then suddenly spur of the moment going into action. Whereas we've seen from Paris, this was carefully planned and coordinated and almost certainly directed from Raqqa in Syria. So that's back to the old Al-Qaeda model of a centralised direction of sending out teams from overseas, from the Middle East or the kind of wider Middle East.
So we've had new counter-terrorism measures announced here. Remind us what they are and what difference they may or may not make.
Right. This morning the government has announced that they are increasing the manpower of the intelligence agencies. That's GCHQ, the listening station, MI5, the domestic security service, and MI6, the overseas intelligence gathering organisation. They're going to increase them by 15%. So 1,900 new intelligence and security officers are going to be added. A lot of those are going to be analysts for GCHQ, because a huge part of the challenge for the government, I think, is to try and break these encrypted apps, or break into them, that terrorists are using to communicate. Because, if they can communicate with each other in the dark without anybody being able to detect them, they can hatch plans like Paris without being detected. So Paris was an intelligence failure, and it may well prove that was the reason behind it. I think the challenge for any government is to make sure that those powers are not abused, that if they get through the bill that they're going to try and get through Parliament to give the intelligence agencies more powers, it's very important that those powers are not abused and started to be used by councils or people sort of snooping on people as to where they live and whether they're putting their rubbish out on time and things like that. The thing that does not address is community policing, which has actually been cut, and I think that's quite dangerous, because one of the big success stories the last 10 years is that communities, not necessarily Muslim communities, but communities all over Britain, have been very good at, including the Muslims, have been very good at feeding up information if they think they're concerned about somebody being radicalised or leaving a bag unattended or whatever. That's a really important part of intelligence gathering. There's a limit to how much you can intercept and sort of do through real traditional intelligence gathering. A lot of it is just simply the public being public spirited. And if you reduce police on the beat and reduce community policing, there is that risk. You're going to lose those eyes and ears on the ground.
Can I just ask you one final question about weapons and ammunition and the kind of things that were used in Paris and where they're coming from and why it's so easy to get them across to France? And is it possible that kind of weaponry could end up in Britain, or much more difficult because we're an island?
It's not impossible. Britain has been spared the kind of big, marauding, multi-pronged terrorist attacks that we've seen in Paris twice now this year, partly because it has tighter border controls that were not part of the Schengen Agreement, which allows free passage of people and materials across borders without checks largely. And I think the French are having a bit of a rethink about that. The weapons come from the Balkans. There's a flourishing arms market in the Balkan states, some of them. And once they enter the EU area in continental Europe, it's very easy for them to cross borders. The Germans got lucky a few days ago that they stopped a car where the boot was full of several AK-47s. Unfortunately, the people who did this didn't think to actually inform the rest of Europe. And even though the guy had in his sat-nav the destination in Paris, so they think quite possibly now, a bit late, he might have been headed for the Paris attacks. Now, who knows if that would have thwarted them? Probably not. But it's that kind of information that needs to be fed in and shared. Powerful automatic weapons like AK-47s that appear in all these big marauding attacks, Nairobi, Mumbai, Paris, haven't so far appeared on the streets in Britain, but we're not immune from it. And there was the IRA connection some time back, which they were worried about. That hasn't fortunately materialized, but nobody is being complacent about this. Weapons and machine guns are the big decisive factor in these marauding attacks, and the longer Britain stays free from them, the better.
Thank you very much, Frank. Frank Gardner, our security correspondent. So what do we know about the identity of the men who carried out the attacks, killing so far 129 people? 7 have been named up to now. They are Salah Abdeslam, who is 26 and is urgently being sought by police. He was actually spoken to by French officers hours after the killings and then released, and is thought to have rented a car in Belgium that was found near the Bataclan Theatre, where 89 people were murdered. 2 of the other suspects are Salah Abdeslam's brothers. Brahim Abdeslam is believed to have blown himself up near the Bataclan, wounding another person. And the third brother, Mohammed, is reported to have been arrested by police in Belgium. Other attackers include 29-year-old Omar Mostafai from near Paris. He died in the attack on the Bataclan. 20-year-old Bilal Hadfi, who's been named as the attacker who died at the Stade de France, and 25-year-old Ahmed Al-Mohammed from Syria, also thought to have died at the stadium. A Syrian passport was found near his body. And then there's 28-year-old Sami Amamou from near Paris, also thought to have died, blown himself up, in fact, at the Bataclan. It's now emerged that he had been charged in a terror investigation back in 2012 over claims that he planned to travel to Yemen. He was placed under judicial supervision, but then dropped off the radar, prompting authorities to issue an international arrest warrant. Our correspondent Ben Brown is in the centre of Paris. Ben.
Yeah, Victoria, we're in the Place de la République, which is a place where people came after the Charlie Hebdo killings back in January to express their defiance and to say that France will not be defeated by terrorism. And they've come back here in the wake of these killings on Friday night. They've lit candles and laid flowers and left messages saying that France and French values of democracy and liberty will not be beaten by terrorist attacks like the ones we saw on Friday night. The death toll currently standing at 129. And this is still very much a city on edge, very tense, a lot of people very nervous. Last night, people heard rumours that shots had been fired. They turned out to be a false alarm, but people around here in the Place de la République were running for their lives and taking cover under tables in cafes, just to give you a sense of the panic, really, that there is still in this city, especially with one of those attackers on the loose, according to the French authorities, that 26-year-old man who is said to be dangerous and the public being warned not to approach him. Well, I'm joined here by 2 senior French politicians to discuss the aftermath of these killings and the implications for France. Christophe Prémat, who's an MP with the ruling Socialist Party, and Yves Pousseau-Dibogo, who's a Paris senator. Thank you very much to both of you. Christophe, first of all, what are your thoughts in the wake of these terrible, terrible attacks that have left so many dead in this beautiful city?
Well, absolutely. It's a very terrifying attack. So it's the most violent attack we ever had in our country since the Second World War. Even though in Paris we were used to have these kind of terror attacks, but I think it was a violent attack. At the same time, a very coordinated action. And we need to think about how we can fight, can we resist against this new type of terrorism. Even though Paris is used to this kind of attacks, I must say.
Yves Bossot-de-Bilgo, the President Hollande has said this is a war now against terrorism. Do you agree with that?
It was not the first time that you have a terrorist attack in Paris. Since a long time, you have in January a very big, strong attack. But I think, I don't know if you are in war, but I can say that it is a war terrorist attack. It's new. It is the first time that it was so hard. And I think you need to think differently. You need to think differently in France to fight this. And you need to think differently in Europe. You need to have Europe with you, England. Some things different with Russia, because now the problem comes from the Syria, from the Iraq. This problem comes this way, and you need to have in Europe, with the Russia and with the American, a way to fight these people who come here to kill us. They come in England too, they come in Germany too, they come in many countries, and you need to fight against this. And you need to have the same thinking, the same solidarity between European, Russia and America.
And Christophe Prémat, some people have asked questions about the French intelligence services. For example, one of the suicide bombers was known to them at least. Have there been failures, do you think, by the intelligence services here?
I wouldn't say that, because we had discussed a lot about the coordination of intelligence services. That was the last spring. So we had this debate in the parliament about how we can have a modern intelligence service action. So I think we have the tool. But of course, what happened just the last days, so we have a lot of emotions right now. So we need to analyze, we need to get back to the parliament and discuss about how we can, together, how we can find out different solutions, because the next attack might be a different way. And that's why we cannot just say that there will be the similar attack. It could be something different, and because everything is flexible, so you have to be to react in that way. I think about our security forces who have to adapt to the new situation right now.
Do you think there will be more attacks?
I don't know if there will be, but we can have more attacks, because we are engaged in a war against the Islamic State in Syria right now. But I think the solution comes from different levels. Foreign policy, we have to think about how we can react in the Middle East right now, what kind of alliance we can have in order to be together. Otherwise, every state can close its borders, and we won't find a good solution. So that's.
And Yves, briefly, do you think there could be more attacks here in France?
I think yes. I think it's not. You are now in new time. I think all is possible. I can say yes, I can say no, but I think it's possible, because in January nobody thinks you never see, and I think it is something. It is for a long time, because a big problem in the world, and I think it is very difficult for us to say. But I think you can have some attacks news.
All right. Well, many thanks to both of you, Yves Bossot-de-Bilgo and Christophe Prémat. Thank you very much indeed. And just to say, there will be a minute's silence here in France and across Europe later today to remember the dead, and President Hollande will be addressing a joint session of both houses of the French Parliament at Versailles later as well. But that's the latest from Paris. Victoria, back to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Just to let you know that the Prime Minister David Cameron, who's at the G20 summit in Turkey, has told a press conference that the summit had agreed, quote, important steps to cut off terrorist financing and counter extremist ideologies. Mr. Cameron telling a press conference at the G20 summit in Turkey that the summit has collectively agreed important steps to cut off terrorist financing and counter extremist ideologies. And you can hear from Mr. Cameron later on BBC News. Well, as Ben was saying, raids are taking place at locations across France, from close to the Belgian border in the north to Toulouse in the south, as well as in the Parisian suburbs. The Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, said the authorities were using the state of emergency to question people who were part of the radical jihadist movement. Our reporter Jim Reid has the latest. You may find some of the pictures in his report disturbing.
I think they were just randomly shooting at first in the dark into the mass of people, just destroy.
We were quite close to the stage, just dancing, We heard a bang. People were screaming, shouting, screaming. They were just firing indiscriminately into the crowd,
A random massacre. it lasted a lifetime or an eternity. It was like probably an hour.
As Paris comes to terms with the worst terror attack since the Second World War, the investigation into what happened on Friday appears to be moving quickly. At the Stade de France in the north of the city, reports that at least one of the suicide bombers had a ticket to the game and tried to get inside before being challenged by security.
Je traversais et directement, boum, ça a explosé devant moi. Donc voilà, ça c'est le portable qui a pris le coup, mais c'est ce qui m'a sauvé. Sinon ma tête, ça partait en éclats.
It was here that police found a Syrian passport near the body of one of the dead attackers. Officials have confirmed it was used to travel the migrant route through Greece last month and up across Serbia and Croatia. But no direct link has yet been made with the attack, and at this stage there is the possibility it was planted, forged or stolen. Around the time of the stadium attack, gunmen struck at 6 different locations in the east of Paris. Most were cafes and restaurants on a busy Friday night.
I thought it was a firecracker to start off with, and then it went on, it got louder. There was a whole pile of bodies, probably about 7 on the left-hand side, and about 4 that had been sitting at the tables outside on the right-hand side.
On Sunday, the focus was on this black Seat car, suspected to have been used as a getaway vehicle in at least one of those attacks. French media said police found it abandoned in the outskirts of the city, with 3 assault rifles and rounds of ammunition on the back seat. It was in the Bataclan concert venue that there was the greatest loss of life. More than 80 are now confirmed dead there, with dozens more in a serious condition in hospital. New footage emerged over the weekend of the moment shooting broke out as the band played. A second car used in this attack has been traced to this man, Salah Abdeslam, one of 3 brothers now suspected of being involved in the attacks. A huge manhunt is now underway for the 26-year-old. He was reportedly stopped by police shortly after the attacks, driving in another car north to the Belgian border, but let go. That international connection now appears to be key. Police made a series of arrests over the weekend in the Molenbeek quarter of the Belgian capital, Brussels, detaining 7 men, including the older brother of Abdeslam. Back in the French capital, the names of the dead attackers are slowly starting to be released. They include another man from that same family. Brahim Abdeslam blew himself up in a bar on Boulevard Voltaire. And Ismail Mostafai. The 29-year-old came from a city south of Paris and had a history of petty crime, but was never jailed. Another 150 police raids have taken place on militant targets across France this morning, in cities from Paris to Grenoble to Toulouse. But in Paris last night, it was about the victims far more than the perpetrators. Funerals will start to take place in the coming days. 129 are now.
Jim Reid reporting. Still to come before 11 o'clock as the UK beefs up its security in response to the Paris attacks. We'll speak to a counter-terror advisor and an expert from the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office on whether more security and intelligence recruits are the answer. I'm sure they will say yes, but we'll have a debate about that with a Labour and Conservative politician as well. 10:30, the main news so far this morning. A manhunt is underway for one of the key suspects of the Paris terror attacks in which 129 people were killed. Police are searching for Brussels-born 26-year-old Salah Abdeslam. It's emerged that he was questioned in the hours afterwards, but then let go. 2 more of the attackers have been named this morning. One was Sami Amamour. He was born in France, and the authorities were already looking for him after he broke bail back in 2013 on terror-related charges. And also Ahmed Al-Mohamed, a Syrian passport, was found near his body. French police carried out more than 160 raids across the country during the night, seizing what they described as an arsenal of weapons, including a rocket launcher. 24 people have been detained. In the last few minutes, the French Interior Minister gave details about the searches.
We have orders to search the household of a number of people. We found a number of automatic pistols and military uniforms and rocket launchers.
France has hit back against the Islamic State militant group in response to the attacks, launching airstrikes against their stronghold in the Syrian city of Raqqa. The Defence Ministry said 20 bombs were dropped in the raid overnight, hitting targets including a command centre, a munitions depot and a training camp. IS has claimed there were no casualties as a result of the strikes. It's emerged that Britain prevented an attack on the UK last month, according to government sources. It comes as more money is to be made available for the security agencies MI5, MI6 and GCHQ. David Cameron says an extra 1,900 officers would help in what he called a generational struggle against extremism. The Prime Minister also told the Today programme on Radio 4 that Britain should consider joining airstrikes on Syria.
I support the action in Syria. We're part of the enablers for that. It's happening anyway. The question is, should we go further and join that action? I've always said I think that it's sensible that we should. ISIL don't recognize a border between Iraq and Syria, and neither should we. But I need to build the argument. I need to take it to Parliament. I need to convince more people. We won't hold that vote unless we can see that Parliament would endorse that action.
In other news, a 16-year-old has been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder after a police officer was attacked in East London. The officer was stabbed in the stomach while responding to reports of antisocial behaviour in Tower Hamlets. Scotland Yard said the constable is in a serious but stable condition. Around 60 flood warnings remain in place across Britain this morning, but the most serious risk is believed to have passed. Torrential rain over the weekend has caused flooding in parts of Cumbria, Lancashire and Yorkshire. Those are the headlines. All the sport now. Here's Jess.
Thank you, Victoria. Good morning. Here's your sports headlines this morning. The French national team travelled to England today after turning down an offer to withdraw from tomorrow's friendly at Wembley following the attacks in Paris. Like many sports stadiums around the world, the Wembley Arch will be lit up in the colours of the French flag. Mercedes driver Nico Rosberg beat his teammate Lewis Hamilton for the second time in a row, winning the Brazilian Grand Prix yesterday. That secured Rosberg's second place in the Drivers' Championship. Andy Murray begins his ATP World Finals campaign later today. He faces David Ferrer at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Murray hasn't had the ideal preparation for this event, though. The world number 2 is also looking ahead to the Davis Cup final against Belgium and face the challenge of having to train for 2 different surfaces. That's all the sport for this morning, Victoria.
Thank you very much. Well, stories of people who survived the attacks in Paris are continuing to emerge, and we can talk now to Marisha Payne from Perth. She was at the Bataclan and survived by running from the scene and hiding in a cellar for 3 hours. Marisha, thank you very much for talking to us this morning. First of all, how are you?
Still a bit shaky and jumpy, but I'm just glad to be home.
Tell us where you were in that venue when you heard the shooting begin.
We were right at the very front, to the left of the stage, right at the end of the barrier.
And what did you think was happening when you first heard the sounds?
I knew it was gunfire. I knew we were under attack.
Did you?
I mean, I think a lot of people thought it was part of the stage show, that it was fireworks. I didn't feel like that. I knew it was a gun going off.
What did you do?
I just looked over, I seen bullets hit the bottom of the stage, and my friend smiled and looked like a lot of people were doing in the confusion, and then instantly there was a second blast of bullets. At this point the band looked very confused, people sort of let out a gasp and they automatically ducked down, and I just said to Christine, "That's gunfire, run, get out of here." And we just ran.
And where did you head to?
We were about 10 feet away from the exit. That would have, if we had gone left, that exit would have taken us out into the street. We went right into the backstage area, which is just, a sort of maze of different rooms.
And ended up where?
First of all, we ran into sort of this larger room. It sort of looked like an equipment room, and there was a little alcove, and we just thought, get your shoes off, we'll be able to run quicker. We had boots on, so we were trying to get our shoes off, and we were sort of cowering in this little alcove, and there was another door. We tried, it was the door to a cupboard. There was another one we tried, it was locked, and then the third one, we ran down a couple of stairs, tried that door, and it opened, and we just ran in. It was a cellar, and we then realised we were trapped.
And could you still hear what was going on in the venue above you?
It was just a stampede and screaming and gunfire.
And of course you wouldn't know if you'd necessarily got to a place of safety, because you don't know where the gunmen will go after that.
No, nothing felt safe at that moment in time. We were just, we went to run back out of the room. We were like, it's silly to stay in here. We can't stay in here. We're trapped. Get out. And as we went to run out, the door swung open and 2 other guys came running in. We were just like, no. And then we realised they were in the same situation as us. And they just shut the door. The room had one of these automatic sensor lights that just kept flickering on and off, and we couldn't get it to go out. We thought we were going to have to smash it with like something, our shoes or something. And one of the Italian guys actually managed to get it off, and we just ran to the very back of the cellar and just crammed ourselves into the smallest space and just waited in darkness.
But as you said, when that door opened and you either shouted or thought no, for that second, you thought potentially that they were gunmen?
Yes, yeah.
Wow. And how long were you in that cellar for, crouched at the back wall?
We didn't get out of that cellar until 1 a.m.
And how did you know to get out, or did someone come and find you?
We heard speaking in English saying, "Are you the police? Are you really the police?" And then it confirmed, yes, we are the police. So we don't know where that other person was hiding, but it was obviously very close to where we were. And then that's when the Italian guys who could speak very good French said, "Du homme de femme," telling them that we were in this, please get us out.
And when you emerged, were you able to see inside the main gig area or not?
They completely surrounded us. They told us not to look down, keep looking forward. You know, we didn't need to see anything, which was good. I mean, you do look down. You have to sort of, we were shaking. You're looking where your feet are going, and there was just blood everywhere. So we obviously knew there was people very injured, very close to where we had been hiding.
How do you reflect, Marisha, on what happened and the fact that you managed to escape?
I feel a little bit guilty. There was only 4 of us in that room. There was another room on the other side, I think very similar to us. There was 25 people crammed into it. Luckily, they all managed to escape as well. After 2 hours, was there people out there that could have been in the room with us? But you just, I think it's every man for themselves at that point. We had to be so quiet, we couldn't move. If any one of us moved or make a sound, we were potentially getting 4 people killed.
Yeah. And what do you think towards the men who did this?
It's just the most cowardly thing to do, to walk in and shoot people in the back. That's what they done. They don't discriminate. There was people of all religions in that building, all races, all having a good time, uniting together in music. That's the last thing you expect to happen to you.
Does it make you think any differently about the way you will? I think we may be losing the FaceTime connection, Marisha, but I'm going to plough on. Hopefully you can still hear me and I can still hear you. Does it make you think any differently about how you will live the rest of your life? Or is it too soon to think about things like that?
I think it certainly will make you conscious. I don't know if you can ever be as carefree again. We were walking down the street yesterday and a guy made a sudden hand move and we jumped out of our skin. That's going to take a little while to get over. Loud noises. I've seen the footage of when the gunfire opened, when it all started, and that just, that scared me. I gasped again. It was like reliving it. But I think we have to get back to being normal. I don't really think anywhere is safe anymore, and we can't live in fear.
Thank you so much, Marisha. I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you for talking to us this morning.
Thank you. Thanks.
Marisha Payne, who says you have to try and get on with things, but for her anyway, she will be perhaps a little less carefree. So David Cameron has said today he is prepared to make compromises with Russia in order to defeat the so-called Islamic State and find some political solution to the civil war in Syria. He's been speaking on Radio 4's Today programme.
Well, of course, we are using our military hard power in Iraq, directly combating ISIL, and they've lost about 25 to 30% of the territory that they held. We're also using our hard military power to stop in their tracks threats to this country, as we did with Khan and Hussein, and indeed helping the Americans with so-called Jihadi John, who all were in Syria.
But you want to extend it to Syria now, the airstrike?
On the issue of going further, I support the action in Syria. We're part of the enablers for that. It's happening anyway. The question is, should we go further and join that action? I've always said I think that it's sensible that we should. There's, ISIL don't recognise a border between Iraq and Syria, and neither should we. But I need to build the argument. I need to take it to Parliament. I need to convince more people. We won't hold that vote unless we can see that Parliament would endorse that action, because to fail on this would be damaging. It's not a question of damaging the government. It's a question of not damaging our country and its reputation in the world. So I will build the case, but in the end, Parliament must decide.
Well, David Cameron is meeting President Putin at the G20 summit of international leaders in Turkey today. In the last few minutes, he's told a press conference that they've agreed important steps to cut off terrorist financing and counter extremist ideologies. More details on that particular press conference later on BBC News. Well, the government has also today announced that MI5, MI6 and GCHQ will get extra funding to recruit nearly 2,000 more officers. Mr. Cameron says he'd used talks with President Putin to urge him to work with the international community and support a transition in Syria away from the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Well, let's talk now to Liam Fox, Conservative MP and former Defence Secretary, who wants Britain to take part in airstrikes in Syria. Also with us, Labour MP Yasmin Qureshi, and a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, who believes airstrikes aren't necessarily the answer. And also we've got two security experts here. Chris Phillips, a former head of the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office, a police unit that supports the government's counter-terrorism strategy. And in our Carlisle studio, counter-terror advisor Simon Trundle. Welcome all of you. Liam Fox, is Britain at war with so-called Islamic State, like France says it is?
I've always been a bit reticent about this term war on terror, because it implies that it's finite in some way and that it can be won in the way that you would win a traditional conflict. We've been living with terrorism for as long as anyone can remember. I described in my book how we lived with the fear of the IRA. We had pub bombings, we saw what happened in Hyde Park, we remember the massacre at Deal. And so these are not new in terms of a particular phenomenon, but what we're seeing is a different way in which it's being perpetrated. And we need to think now about how we combine what we're doing domestically with counter-terrorism, with what we're doing in terms of our foreign policy. And you're correct, I think that Britain should have been involved in strikes against ISIS. If they are a threat to the United Kingdom and our people, and we have a way to degrade that threat, we ought to be taking it.
Right. And alongside that, a parallel diplomatic strategy?
I think if you think about it in terms of different spaces, there's the information space, and that's to do with the ideological battle and the messages we have to get across to try to prevent radicalization and deal with that side of the threat. Then there's the physical battle space, dealing with ISIS on the ground. And I think that there's going to be a growing question after all of this as to whether the international coalition is working and whether it needs to go further in terms of how we deal with ISIS on the ground. They do have now a territory that they're operating from that needs to be denied to them.
Yasmin Qureshi, bearing in mind what we've all seen at the weekend, why are you still against airstrikes against so-called Islamic State in Syria?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, we actually had an inquiry into this, and we just published a report about a week and a half ago. And talking to the experts on the ground and people who know quite a lot of what's happening in Syria and in Iraq on the ground, what seems to be for months we've now been doing strikes, bombing, etc. in Iraq and Syria.
Britain hasn't been bombing Syria.
We haven't dented ISIS strength. In fact, they seem to be getting stronger and stronger. And that is why I don't have a problem about airstrikes or bombing of people who carry out these kinds of actions. I think the question we need to do is, what are we going to achieve at the end of it? Because we have been bombing for months on end, and in some respect ISIS has become stronger and stronger. And one of the reasons it's becoming stronger and stronger because Assad is also somebody that needs to be dealt. The biggest recruiting sergeant for ISIS is the presence and existence of Assad and what he's doing. He's barrel bombing, he's killing. You know, most of the people fleeing from Syria, the refugees, are not actually fleeing, some from Daesh, but most are fleeing from Assad and what he's doing. And until and unless we deal with him, and we come with a proper solution on how to deal with the matter in the Middle East, we're not going to get away from these kind of things. So that's why, you know, somehow suggesting that, okay, we send few more airstrikes into Syria is a panacea, it's going to solve the problem. It isn't. And what I'm interested in, and I think what a lot of people need to be concentrating our mind is, what is the way to actually bring this conflict to an end and to actually stop ISIS? And one of the things is, as mentioned, about their money. The other is stop people from joining them, and the third, of course, is actually not giving them a lot of publicity and, you know, allowing them to be able to go on the internet and put out all their nasty, horrific things that they're doing, which is trying to frighten people.
Let me bring Chris Phillips. Nearly 2,000 new security and intelligence jobs being created, as well as doubling the aviation security budget. How much difference will that make?
Well, it will, and I feel a bit guilty about putting a negative to a positive, because it's a good thing that we've got these new people in place. However, 3 or 4 years ago, we had them in place anyway, and the security services have actually reduced the numbers of people. So
it's
yes,
going
it's
back
a good
up
thing
to the capacity that we had a few years ago.
And I think we've got to be careful about knee-jerk reactions. We need these people all the time. It's not something that we just need after an attack. These people take time to train, and they take time to get into a position where they can do their job properly.
Simon Trundle, how prepared is the UK for a Paris-style attack?
I think a lot of effort and work has been done by the police security services in preparation for just an attack like Paris. But it's all it's intelligence dependent, because hopefully we'll detect the attack before it takes place, or be able to respond very positively after the attack by being able to round up any other supporters or anybody else who's still out there. You'll never be prepared for every attack. They will have some successes in terms of terrorism like Paris, because it is a very low technology attack. It's some men with weapons marauding through the streets, and you just cannot respond quick enough every time to that type of attack.
And what should citizens do if they were ever to find themselves in that scenario?
Well, the simple advice is duck, run and hide. You know, don't go towards an attack. If you hear something that sounds unusual and odd, treat it as being just that, dangerous, and move away as quickly as possible. Do not congregate in an area. Business owners should look, a lot of time I'm advising people who are saying, well, what should we do at our entrances? And I said, well, if an attack starts off, or rumour of an attack, or evidence of an attack starts off, then how about closing down your own entrance? How about evacuating your own people into places of safety so that they are no longer a target within the general area?
Liam Fox, in terms of the French bombing that main base in Raqqa overnight, they destroyed apparently a training camp and a munitions depot. Do they need Britain to join in?
Well, I think that Britain should be joining in to show our solidarity with it. I think it's an absurd policy to be attacking ISIS, who we regard as a threat to us, on one side of a non-existent border, but not attacking them on the other side. I don't think in any way it's a panacea. It's part of how we deal with them. And
would that make Britain more of a terrorist target?
No, I do, and I think this is the number one mistake that people make. These people hate us because of who we are, not because of what we do. And
although what they said, as you know, about France is, because of France's intervention in Syria, that's why France was a target at the weekend.
And, what about places that have been targets before? This sort of justification doesn't wash, and we mustn't allow that justification to be made. These have hated us. These people have a very vicious anti-Western political ideology that is married to a religious fundamentalism, and we mustn't allow the excuse to be made that it's our fault that they're doing these things.
Yasmin Qureshi, you're disagreeing?
I disagree, because I agree with the fact it is not a justification, but I think it's a very simple thing to say it is because they hate our way of life. Yet every time these things occur, whether it happened in London or whether it happened in Paris, and these people, when some of them are arrested, they always say, and now this has to be, I hope people will hear what I'm saying, is not a justification, but they give their explanation about our interventions in their countries and what's going on. Because if you think about all this terrorism and all the war that's been happening in the last number of years in the Middle East, most of the people who've died have been Muslim people. Yes, so hundreds and thousands of them have died. So the issue here is what they say is that it is our various interventions. Now, I'm not saying they are right.
Liam Fox wants to come back on that.
The bombers of the London Underground were third-generation British.
Yeah.
It wasn't someone else's country. We have to understand why jihadists are jihadists. They have a very, very clear ideology. They hate our values, our history, and who we are as a country. No. They are using a perverse form of interpretation of Islam to justify that. And it is not. It has happened before in interventions. 9/11 in New York happened before there was any American intervention in that part of the world. This we have to understand and not make excuses for these terrorists.
Okay, I'm going to pause there because I want to bring viewers this breaking news, and it's being reported by Reuters, and it's from Belgian police. They say they have arrested the wanted suspect, Salah Abdeslam. Now, this is the French national who was actually stopped and questioned after the attacks on Friday night, but the French police stopped him on the border with Belgium and then let him go. Belgian police are now saying that they have arrested the wanted suspect, Salah Abdeslam, that being reported by Reuters in the last minute or two. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming on the programme. Thank you for your time. Thank you. We want to show you now these pictures where people across France and throughout Europe are gathering to observe a minute's silence at 11 o'clock our time to honour the victims of the Gun and bomb attacks in Paris on Friday, in which so far 129 people have been killed. President Hollande will lead the tributes in France at the Sorbonne University in recognition of the many who lost their lives. People are gathering right across France, as you'd imagine, to pay tribute. And these images show you the Place de la République, the main gathering point for Parisians to pay their respects. In London, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, will represent the British government, observing the silence at the French embassy.
En hommage aux morts victimes des attentats terroristes en France, et je voudrais remercier Madame Theresa May d'être ici au nom du gouvernement britannique pour exprimer sa solidarité. So, Minister, I would like to thank you to show your solidarity here and the solidarity of the British government. It's very important, of course, for France.
That's at the French embassy, but in Trafalgar Square, people are beginning to gather too. Floral tributes have been laid, as you can see. Just to bring you that news again that I mentioned a minute or so ago, it's being reported on RTL Radio that Belgian police say they have arrested the wanted suspect, Salah Abdeslam. That just in the last minute or so. Let's go back to Ben Brown in Paris.
Will you join us here in Place de la République in the heart of Paris? The sun is shining, but it is a very sombre mood here as people come to this famous square, this famous monument which proclaims the French values of liberty, equality and fraternity, to remember the dead as part of France's 3 days of national mourning. This is where they have been lighting candles and laying flowers ever since the attacks happened on Friday night in memory of the dead. The death toll currently standing at 129. fears that that death toll could rise because so many of the injured are critically ill. But as well as flowers here, they have left messages of defiance, as they did after the Charlie Hebdo killings in January, saying that France will not be defeated by terrorism. And in a minute or so's time, there will be a minute's silence observed here in Paris, across France, and across Europe for the people who lost their lives on Friday night. Some of them teenagers, some of them young people in their 20s, attending that rock concert at the Bataclan, people who were going to a football match at the Stade de France, people who were just out for a Friday night in the heart of this beautiful city. Will you join us here in Place de la République, in the heart of Paris, where people are gathering to observe a minute's silence for the 129 who were killed on Friday night in the terror attacks which have devastated this city. They've been coming here ever since Friday to lay flowers and light candles and leave messages of condolence. And here in Paris and across France and across Europe, there will be a minute's silence in memory of all those who lost their lives on Friday night. One of the most devastating attacks in Europe since the Second World War.
Je vous remercie. A minute's silence there, impeccably observed here at Place de la République, in the heart of Paris, and throughout France and throughout Europe, in memory of the 129 people who died on Friday night, attending that rock concert at the Bataclan, or the football match at the Stade de France, or just out in the heart of Paris for a Friday evening. This is a city that is learning to live with fear. Well, we saw pictures there of President Hollande observing the minute's silence at Sorbonne University. And this is part of 3 days of mourning for the victims of Friday night. And France really at the moment is a country that is in grief, in mourning, but is also trying to spontaneous applause there after that minute's silence. And people really here in Place de la République have come to show a spirit of great unity in France, the same spirit that they showed after the Charlie Hebdo shootings in January, which caused such fear in this city. And now the year that began with those Charlie Hebdo shootings and brought terror to Paris has ended with even deadlier terrorist attacks. 129 dead, hundreds injured in those attacks, many of those injured critically ill, and there are fears that the death toll could rise. News coming through all the time about the investigation into the attacks, into the people who carried them out, much more information beginning to emerge. But right now, this has been a moment, and this minute's silence has been a time to reflect on the dead. I'm joined here now by the French journalist Agnès Poirier. Thanks for being with us. And what are your thoughts there, Agnès, after this minute's silence, so impeccably observed, and that spontaneous round of applause?
Well, I was expecting the minute to actually last 20 or 30 minutes, which happened in January last time. Yes, I guess, you know, what is very heartwarming is that this minute of silence is taking place actually throughout Europe and throughout the world. So, now expecting perhaps to hear the Marseillaise. So, you know, this is a city in mourning, but then there will be questions to be asked.
Questions about the security services. We should just say that we are getting reports that the manhunt for the 26-year-old suspect who is thought to have been part of this operation, Salah Abdeslam, a 26-year-old man, has been detained. We're hearing unconfirmed reports that he's been detained in Belgium. What are your thoughts on that? Because a huge manhunt for him, and obviously while he was at large, police were saying he was dangerous, that was spreading fear in Paris.
Well, I mean, we know now that this coordinated attacks had been planned, possibly by the same cell that had prepared the Thalys train attack and the Villejuif, if you remember, the thwarted attacks on Catholic churches. So it's relentless, isn't it? It will keep on trying, and if you keep on trying, at some point you succeed.
We're also hearing about a possible mastermind for this whole plot who has been named as Abdelhamid Abaoud.
Absolutely. Who is supposedly behind those thwarted attacks? I mean, you know, today David Cameron said that since at the beginning of the year, I think it was 7 attacks that have been thwarted, 5 in France since the summer, and that's only the ones that they are ready to tell us about. You know, we know that intelligence services are overstretched and overworked. So perhaps, you know, I think when you wage a war of that kind, you know, I'm not sure about bombings, but I'm sure about intelligence gathering and sharing. You know, so I think this is the key question that will be asked to the French president, and also about, you know, cooperation with other governments in Europe, within Europe. If indeed there was a cell in Belgium, why didn't we know about it? We're talking, I mean, the identified suicide bombers are French nationals. They were known to the services, and actually some of them had been arrested, interrogated. So, you know, what happened?
Agnès, for the moment, thank you. Do stay with us, but thank you, because I'm just going to bring in our Brussels correspondent, Alex Forsyth, who's got the latest on those reports that the wanted man, the 26-year-old man who was on the run, has now been detained. One of the key suspects behind the attacks here in Paris on Friday night. Alex, what more can you tell us?
Yeah, well, we understand there is a significant police operation ongoing at the moment in the Molenbeek area of Brussels, which is the neighbourhood that was raided by officers on Saturday and has been a very central part of this investigation. Belgian media are reporting a large police presence there, a number of officers in balaclavas, police vans, police dogs. And on Belgian radio, there are reports that some explosions have been heard, although we have not been able to verify that. A BBC colleague who is at the scene, though, has been told by one officer that this is very much an ongoing operation and a very significant police presence there. What we have not been able to confirm yet is those reports which have been circulating that a significant arrest has been made. As you say, that has been put out on social media in particular. But just to confirm, those reports at this stage aren't verified. All we can confirm is that there is a significant operation ongoing in a very key area of Brussels.
And Alex, what's becoming clear is that these three brothers, the Abdeslam brothers, were a key component of this conspiracy of these attacks in Paris.
That's very much become the centre of this investigation, a key line of inquiry. What we understand about these three brothers is that one blew himself up, a gunman, during the attacks in Paris. A second was arrested by the Belgian authorities. We understand he's saying he has nothing to do with the Paris attacks and his lawyer is pressing for his release. But it is the third brother, Salah Abdeslam, who is very much the focus of this ongoing manhunt. Authorities trying to trace him with the suggestion that he had been intercepted near the French-Belgian border on Saturday, then allowed to proceed on his way. So since then, there have been information put out asking about his whereabouts, and we know that the authorities are looking for him. It's thought the car that he had been travelling in on Saturday was found in the Molenbeek area of Brussels by the authorities here, and that is where this operation is happening as we speak. But just to reiterate, what we do not know for sure yet is whether any significant arrest has been made at this stage. But the Molenbeek area is, of course, very much the focus of police inquiries and investigations here in Brussels.
And Alex, just tell us a little bit more about this area, Molenbeek. It's been called a kind of hotbed of jihadism. Just describe a little bit more about what it's like there.
This is a neighbourhood some 4 miles from the centre of Brussels, but very much part of the city. It's got a diverse, a very transient population, largely working class, high levels of unemployment, largely a residential area. I was there over the weekend on Saturday and on Sunday, and people are there quite surprised to find themselves at the heart of this huge investigation. But it's not the first time that Molenbeek has been linked to inquiries into extremism or operations to do with anti-terror. Just a few examples of when that's happened. You'll remember an attempted attack on a high-speed train from Brussels to France. There were police searches in the Molenbeek area following that attack. And earlier this year, following the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, there were a series of unrelated anti-terror operations in the days that followed, and some of those took place in the Molenbeek area of Brussels. So an area certainly with links to previous operations and investigations into extremism, which of course is causing concern for people that live there, hearing about this apparent link to the latest attacks in Paris. And just to mention that it's not just Molenbeek. Across Belgium as a whole, there is a higher number of people per head of the population who are thought to have gone and joined Islamist organisations overseas. So the connection with the Paris attacks really is raising questions just about the scope and scale of possible radicalisation in Belgium.
Okay, Alex, thank you very much indeed. Alex Forsyth reporting with the very latest there from Brussels. Let's go to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, in London, because, Norman, we've been hearing that the authorities in London are saying that a plot in Britain was foiled within the last few weeks. Just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the Prime Minister this morning, Ben, said that seven plots had been foiled in the past 6 months. So, you know, that is a plot thwarted every month, which gives you a sense of the intensity of the challenge we now appear to face from extremists and terrorists like Islamic State. Let me also tell you that the Home Secretary, Theresa May, will be making a statement in the Commons about security in Britain. We can expect that around about 3:30 this afternoon, and she will be outlining the security procedures that have been put in place on the day that Downing Street announced significant extra resources to recruit more intelligence and security officers. Around 1,900 additional spies, if you want to call them that, are going to be recruited. The budget for aviation, airport security is to be doubled, and there will be a review of airport security at airports in the Middle East and in North Africa, airports which are used heavily by British holiday makers. But critical too today will be the conversations between David Cameron and President Putin and whether they can reach some sort of agreement and focus their diplomatic efforts on tackling IS. This morning, just listen to Mr. Cameron's words when he was on the radio. I thought he was sounding much more accommodating about President Putin. Have a listen.
Now, the disagreement has been that we think Assad should go at once, and obviously Russia has taken a different view. And we have to find a settlement where Assad leaves and there is a government that can bring Syria together. And we mustn't let the gap between us be the altar on which this country of Syria is slaughtered.
Now, that bilateral between President Putin and David Cameron has now taken place, and Mr. Cameron at that seemed to be stressing the need to try and get some sort of peace plan in place. And the reason for that, there is a big domestic reason, and the domestic reason is that if Mr. Cameron can present to MPs a coherent diplomatic plan, then he's much more likely to get support for military action. Ben, back to you in Paris.
I've got Agnes here as well. Norman, thank you very much indeed. Norman Smith there, our assistant political editor. Let's just take you back to pictures from Brussels. I think we can show you some pictures again from the Molenbeek area of Brussels, where there's been a lot of activity in the last few minutes as police continue their investigations. It's very clear, and it's been emerging really in the last 24 hours or so, that these attacks here in Paris were at least partly planned in Belgium. Very strong links between Belgium and these attackers. And I should just say that Belgian state radio, RTBF, is saying that the prosecutor's office there is denying those reports we had that the 26-year-old man who police have been looking for in connection with these attacks, Salah Abdeslam, there were reports he'd been arrested. That was being reported on RTL, but that's now being denied, we're hearing from the Belgian prosecutor's office. So some confusion, but this is a man who is thought to have been involved in the attacks, who managed to get away from Paris and cross over the border back into Belgium, it seems. There had been reports he'd been arrested as part of this huge manhunt for him, but now it looks like that's being denied by the Belgian prosecutor's office. Let's go back to Alex Forsyth, our correspondent in Brussels. Obviously, events moving very fast here, Alex, and quite considerable confusion about exactly what's going on. What's your understanding?
That's right. The first reports that we had of a significant police operation came in perhaps an hour, 90 minutes ago. Something is happening in the Molenbeek area of Brussels, which is a neighbourhood a few miles from the city centre, but very much part of the city. What we know is that there is a significant police presence there. We've seen pictures on social media and Belgian media of police vans, police dogs, dozens of officers wearing balaclavas. There have been some reports in local media of explosions being heard, but we haven't been able to verify those. But a colleague of mine, a BBC colleague who is in the area, spoke to a police officer who said that this is very much an ongoing operation and has been for the last hour or so. Just to remind you that this district, this area, was the one which was subject to a number of police raids on Saturday, and a number of arrests were made there in connection with the Paris attacks. Since then, it has been very central to the inquiry. I was there yesterday and it was much quieter, a few police cars and vans patrolling, but it seems this morning that another significant operation has got underway. There is confusion about any arrests that may or may not have been made. As you say, there were reports that a key arrest in this investigation had been made, but the Belgian federal prosecutor has told the Belgian state broadcaster that that's not the case. So there is no confirmation that any significant arrests have been made at this stage. We are, of course, trying to get details from the Belgian federal prosecutor to confirm exactly what has happened. But for now, what is clear is that there is a significant operation underway.
Okay, Alex, thank you very much indeed. Let's go to my colleague Christian Fraser, who is also in Brussels, I think in Molenbeek, where this is going on. Christian, tell us what you can see and what's going on there.
Well, a huge area of Molenbeek has been sealed off, and we're just trying to find our way to the street where we know the special police unit has been sent. I've just been speaking to a Belgian colleague who said that they've seen a commando unit or a special armed police force going down a street with a camera on a pole. So what appears to have happened is that one of the suspects came out of the apartment that they forced their way into quite early, but there's another holed up inside. At the beginning, there were reports that police were trying to negotiate with that person through a megaphone, but clearly that person's still not come out, so the police operation is ongoing, and it would seem, putting two and two together, that they're trying to get a view into the apartment through the window with this camera on a long pole, and I think that's where we're at the moment. So it sounds like a rather tense stand-up, but as Alex was saying, the early reports that Salah Abdeslam is in that apartment seem a little premature. There's conflicting reports as to who they're trying to find, but I think what you do get from all this is the sense of urgency. They know they have a very dangerous man on the run, and the longer that he's at large, of course, the risk grows, and the risk that there could be another attack.
And embarrassing, Christian, for the French authorities that they appear to have allowed him to cross the border from France. There are reports that he was questioned on Saturday as he drove across the border and then released. His papers were checked and then he was released. But also, I suppose there are questions for the Belgian authorities, because it does look as though this whole plot behind the attacks here in Paris on Friday night was hatched largely in Belgium, in Brussels, and so questions for the French intelligence authorities, but also for the Belgians.
Yes, obviously questions for the French intelligence service. I mean, obviously they managed to trace the Abdeslam brothers pretty quickly. They found a parking ticket in the Polo that was abandoned near the Bataclan Theatre, and that linked to the VW Golf that Salah Abdeslam had driven across the border. The names were on the system, but too late for the border police to pick it up. But obviously they were checked again as to who had gone across the border, and there was the name they were looking for. So hugely embarrassing in that aspect. There are reports in some newspapers today that car, that Golf that they were driving, was seen coming into Molenbeek and was forced onto the pavement, and armed police stopped it, but one of the occupants managed to get away, and presumably, if that report is true, and it's not been corroborated, but if that is true, then it would seem that Salah was the one that escaped. So it might not just be once, it might be twice that they lost him. As for this place where I am, Molenbeek, well, he keeps coming up in all manner of investigations, going back 12 years to the Madrid train bombings, and then you've got the attack, the failed attack, the foiled attack, if you will, on the fast train to Paris in August. Koulibaly, the shooter at the supermarket during the week of Charlie Hebdo, had some links to this place, and Mehdi Namouche, the man who was picked up for the attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels, he was another one linked to this area. I think what we have to say about Molenbeek is that it is quite a big district. It's a northwestern district of Brussels, so it's not a small town. It's not a concentrated spot, although the Muslim population who have their roots in Morocco and Algeria live in one particular part of it. So I suppose in that respect it is still surprising that so many investigations link back to this spot.
Okay, Christian, thank you very much indeed. Christian Fraser with the very latest there from Brussels. Let's go back to Agnès Poirier, my guest here in Paris, where we are at the Place de la République after that emotional minute silence for the victims. But just speaking about Belgium, it's very clear, isn't it, that there are questions for the Belgian authorities to answer, and it does look once again as though this area, Molenbeek, that we've just been talking about, is a sort of hotbed of jihadism and of conspiracy.
And it's not new. It's not as if we didn't know that part of Brussels is actually a hotbed of terrorism. Yes, that's really a European-wide question and problem. And as French Prime Minister Manuel Valls said this morning, they are expecting more attacks in France, but also in Europe. So we also know that the mastermind behind the Paris attacks was also behind a few thwarted attacks. One in the spring against Catholic churches in Villejuif, just outside of Paris, and the Thalys train attack that was thwarted thanks to the bravery of passengers. So, you know, there will be more to come. So now there are urgent questions to be asked about how intelligence services, but not only in France, throughout Europe, can actually work better together.
You say there will be more to come. What you know, people are out on the streets in Paris today. I mean, when we were here on Saturday, it was very quiet. People really felt, I think, nervous, didn't even want to leave their homes. Now they are out on the streets. But are they learning to live with fear, do you think?
I don't think it's with fear, because, you know, there were Paris attacks in January, okay? So that was the first shot, the first, you know, awakening. And we have learned as Parisians or as French people to live with the French armed forces in our streets. You know, this is new.
The president says this is a country at war with terrorism.
Well, yes, but France has been at war with Islamic, radical Islamists for years. We had a wave of bombings in the mid-90s. I was a student there in Paris, and it was already the Algerian Islamic Brigade. So it's not new. It's just that the terror is mutating, taking new form, and it's a challenge.
Okay, Agnès, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Agnès Poirier there with me here in Place de la République in Paris. Let's go now to the G20 summit in Turkey, and Vicky Young, our chief political correspondent, is there with the latest. Vicky.
Yeah, well, Ben, we have had that meeting this morning between David Cameron and President Putin of Russia. Number 10 officials say that they had constructive and measured discussions, but there's no doubt that there was some honesty on both sides. David Cameron said later at a press conference that he made it clear to Mr. Putin that bombing moderate opposition forces in Syria was a mistake. The question now, of course, is what happens in Syria. All the sides here are trying to put pressure on President Putin to agree a political transitional process. Of course, there is a certain irony here for David Cameron. He is urging the Russians to spend more time attacking ISIL forces in Syria with bombing raids. Of course, the UK, are not involved in all of that because the Parliament in the UK are not willing to sanction it. He admitted when I asked him about this at the press conference that he had to do more to persuade people of the case. They had to make sure he brought more people with him, that he brought Parliament with him, and he acknowledged that there would need to be a fuller, broader political plan in place for the future of Syria before he could really persuade those Labour MPs, opposition MPs, and someone on his own side that the UK should be involved in those airstrikes.
Now, very briefly, Vicky, is there a coming together after these dreadful attacks in Paris among world leaders?
in terms of what they should do about
to people, you have to go and live your lives as normal, but you have to be vigilant. He made it clear that, of course, you're not going to have 100% security in a free, democratic world.
Continue to affect the northern quarter of Scotland through the overnight period. Meanwhile, this area of low pressure sweeps across England and Wales, bringing wet and windy weather. This next storm, which comes in on Tuesday, is actually being the second named storm.
I'm Ben Brown, reporting live from the Place de la République here in the heart of Paris, where they've been observing impeccably, as you would expect, a minute's silence in memory of those 100. Another of his brothers, Mohamed Abdeslam, is reported to have been arrested in Belgium, and Belgium has been very much the focus for the police activity in the last hour or so. A lot Yemen, but then he broke bail the following year in 2013, and an international arrest warrant was then issued for him. 3 of his relatives have been detained, and that is another embarrassment potentially for the French intelligence services, that this man was on their radar screens but managed to
obviously not by exact time and place, but did predict attacks in France and elsewhere in Europe. because, of course, the Islamic State has declared war on our countries. In terms of the way that the intelligence services operate, I think it's easy to criticise, and no doubt a number of areas will come to light, some already are. But it's a really tough job for the French intelligence service, as it is for ours here in the UK, attacks taking place.
And as I mentioned, you worked with Cobra on the intelligence group there. What's your sense of what British intelligence will be trying to find out now about these attacks? And we heard also from Number 10 that there have been a number of attacks very recently in Britain that have been foiled by British intelligence.
Well, clearly the relationship with my counterpart in Paris, as the intelligence services do today. And they will be working hard, exchanging intelligence and trying to help the French. And then, of course, there's the kind of...
Well, obviously there is a very big police operation underway at the moment, Ben. A large part of Molenbeek has been sealed off in the past couple of hours. We've got a producer right on the police tape, and he said to me that he's seen in the last 20 minutes or so A special police unit going down a street towards an apartment with a camera on top of a pole, and they're trying to get a view through a window that it was stopped here, and they fled from the car. And so for the moment I think they're confident that he is still in the Brussels area, but as I say, anyone that can give them any to Paris. He was linked to Koulibaly, the shooter at the supermarket in the week of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and Medina Mouche, the man who was involved in the attack on the Jewish Museum here in Brussels. So time and again it keeps cropping up, and I think what police and indeed the politicians now know is that there's a culture of secrecy among a section of the society here in Molenbeek that provides some...
They're really known as a hotbed of Islamic extremism.
Yeah, I think in the words of the Belgian Prime Minister, they've taken their eye off this place for far too long. He talked about laxity, meaning that they just not really faced up to the threat that was here for many years. One of the problems in this area was that there was a group that was
We'll keep you up to date with all the developments from there and indeed from here in Paris throughout the day, of course. But for the moment, you are watching BBC News.
Gain 30% of ISIL territory in Iraq, retake Kobane, and push ISIL back towards Raqqa. On Friday, Kurdish forces retook Sinjar. The UK is playing its part, training local forces, striking targets in Iraq, and providing vital intelligence support. And seamless cooperation between the UK and the US is delivering results, as the strike against Emwazi
We're at the Place de la République, where there's been a minute's silence to remember the dead, 129 people who lost their lives on Friday night at the Bataclan concert hall just up the road.
We heard today that there have been 7 thwarted plots in the last 6 months, so that is 1 plot a month, which gives you an idea of the intensity of the threat we now seem to face from so-called Islamics who win it. Well, joining me is the former Conservative Defence Secretary, Liam Fox. I mean, how likely do you think is the prospect of another vote on airstrikes in Syria?
Well, I think operating, the strategy has been to contain ISIS, and they have not been contained. And it may well be that we have to look at an international coalition in the way that we had an international coalition in the first Gulf War against Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in order to deny the physical space to ISIS.
Liam Fox, thanks very much for your time there. Of course, that coalition included American and, yes, British troops on the ground.
But what are your thoughts on what this means for France?
We're still recovering from a huge shock because I think people got used after Charlie Hebdo in January to a kind of new
Hello there. We've seen a lot of rain at the weekend, which caused some flooding in places, particularly northern England, parts of North Wales, southwest Scotland. The bad news is, although river levels have peaked and then the strong winds move in later on, a mild day to come across southern areas, chilly across the north. So that heavy rain sweeps through, but Storm Barney will produce gusts of 60 to 70 miles an hour initially to Wales and then
look towards the future.
An island that I really didn't know. A two-part series, Ireland with Simon Reeve. Starts Sunday at 8 on BBC Two.
That this man, Abdelhamid Abaoud, also from Belgium, masterminded the attacks on the French capital. Here in Paris, across France and across Europe, there's been a minute's silence to remember all those who lost their lives. Prime Minister David Cameron at the G20 summit in Turkey has said the fight against so-called Islamic State in Syria must go on. Hello, welcome to BBC News. We're here live in the heart of Paris in Place de la République, which after the Charlie Hebdo shootings back in January became a focal point for Parisians to come and show defiance. And now, after these latest terror attacks on Friday night, they're again coming here and laying flowers at the monument here, lighting candles to remember the dead, and also putting up posters expressing their defiance, saying that Paris and France will not be cowed by terrorism. Well, there's a big police operation going on right now in Brussels in connection with the attacks that were here in Paris. Let's go to Alex Valsyth, our correspondent there, with the latest. Alex.
Yeah, there is a significant operation underway in the Molenbeek area of Brussels, which is a neighbourhood just a few miles from the city centre. There are reports on social media and Belgian TV, images of a large police presence, a number of officers in balaclavas, along with police cars and vans and police dogs. Also reports of possibly some sort of operation centred on a particular property. The official Belgian police Twitter feed asked media to stop publishing live photographs or close-up images of that particular property. So from that you could deduce perhaps there is a person of interest inside. There are conflicting reports about the significance of this operation, whether or not the people that are clearly of interest to police are significant, or what role they may have played in these Paris attacks. But just to remind you that this area, Molenbeek, where this significant operation is currently underway, was where a number of police raids were carried out on Saturday and a number of arrests made in connection with the Paris attacks, and it has remained of particular interest to police since. This operation has been underway now today for a couple of hours. Clearly a lot of police on the ground, so significant, absolutely. Exactly what the significance is, we're not yet sure.
And Alex, Molenbeek, this district of Brussels, has been linked with previous terror plots, and it's known as, I suppose, something of a hotbed of Islamic extremism.
Yeah, there are plenty of local people who would say that the descriptions of Molenbeek have been hyped up, perhaps in defence of this neighbourhood of Brussels, but undoubtedly it has been connected with several cases of extremism. Just to name a few, you'll remember there was a foiled attack on a high-speed train from Belgium to France earlier this year. Police carried out a number of searches in the Molenbeek area in the wake of that. And the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris at the beginning of the year, following that, there were a number of unconnected anti-terror raids. Some of those took place in the Molenbeek area as well. So, yes, absolutely. And the suggestion of links to do with the most recent Paris attacks have really just fueled concern about the level of possible radicalisation.
Okay, Alex, thank you very much indeed. Alex Forsyth with the latest from Belgium. And the latest on the police investigation here in France in the wake of these attacks is that there have been a huge number of police raids yesterday and overnight. Almost 170 police raids on a variety of addresses right across France in cities like Grenoble and Toulouse, a district here in Paris, an area close to the border with Belgium as well. Quite a lot of people have been arrested. Also, weapons have been found, including, we are told, a rocket launcher. Let's get the latest from our Paris correspondent, Hugh Schofield.
France came to a stop at midday. It was a moment of public sorrow and private recollection, a chance to ponder and perhaps to pray. Nothing like Friday's events has been known in France in times that were not of war. But President Hollande said that the country is now at war. That is certainly something to contemplate. And war has been the immediate response. Attacks by the French Air Force on IS targets in Syria are the start, says Paris, of a newly intensive air campaign. Skeptics are dubious. Such raids can have much effect, but some riposte was inevitable. And on the ground in France and Belgium, police have staged a series of sweeps and arrests. The focus is in Brussels, on the neighbourhood of Molenbeek, long reputed to be a hotbed of jihadism. The prime target is this man, Salah Abdeslam, who investigators believe was the 8th attacker. He fled the scene and is believed to have headed to Brussels. Another man who's been named, but out of reach of European police, is Abdelhamid Abaoud, a Belgian of Moroccan descent now with IS in Syria. He, it's reported, could be the man who ordered the attacks. But the events are still raw. There's still much work to be done before officials can know how the attacks were planned and who exactly was behind them. Hugh Schofield, BBC News, Paris.
Well, let's go now to my colleague Anna Holligan, who's just down the road from here at the Bataclan Concert Hall, which is where the majority of those who were killed on Friday night died, many of them young people in their teens and 20s attending a concert by an American rock band. And Anna, I think you were there for the minute silence.
We were. 89 people were killed here at the Bataclan music event. It was the most bloody carnage on Friday night, and we did arrive in time for the moment's silence. It felt like a lot longer than 1 minute, and it took place, the majority of people were just behind us here, and everything stopped. It was entirely silent in what is normally a very busy, as you can see now around me, area here. People have been coming all day, leaving flowers or just waiting for a moment to think about what happened inside that cafe. And it was very poignant. Just towards the end of the silence, it was broken by the sound of sirens blaring, a reminder of the very tense atmosphere that's underpinning French society today. And people are walking around, they're going back to work, they're going to school, the public transport's working again. But as long as this man, one of the suspected attackers, is still on the run, it's very difficult for people here to forget about what happened and be able to get on with their everyday lives. And you mentioned the raids there, Ben. 170 raids across the country overnight. And the Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, talked about the fact that they were aware that attacks were being planned. And he also said, as far as they're aware, there are more attacks being planned, not just here in France, but across Europe. And in Lyon, at the site of one of those raids, they found a rocket launcher, they found bulletproof vests, an assault rifle, Kalashnikovs. Kalashnikovs, of course, were carried by each of the 7 attackers who were involved in the Friday night attacks, and all of them were wearing explosive vests or belts. It's the first time in French history that people have blown themselves up inside this country. And I'm just going to step aside. I wanted to show you one picture here, one of the tributes down on the ground, behind the red peppers and white flowers, peace, love, and death metal. And that's what these people had come here on Friday night to listen to, and instead, of course, it turned into the bloodbath, as we are all now aware.
And Anna, you mentioned what the French Prime Minister Manuel Valls was saying about France needing to brace itself possibly for more attacks. Do you think, what is your sense of the mood here in Paris now? People really seem to be coming to terms with living with fear, but living on the edge. We saw that real panic around this area where you are and down here on Place de la République last night as people ran because there was a false alarm that there had been more shooting, and people just running in their hundreds.
They just scattered. The tributes went everywhere, the flowers, the candles, and it was firecrackers, but it just showed how tense the situation is here. And people haven't been going to the public parks or congregating in public spaces here over the weekend, but they have been coming in their thousands to lay tributes, and they've all been reading about the events that happened just behind here. This is the Bataclan nightclub, and we've been hearing from some of the victims who were involved. They took cover under dead bodies. The attackers were up on the balcony shooting down indiscriminately, and that's one of the reasons that people here are now so afraid. These weren't government buildings, they weren't tourist attractions that were being targeted, they were soft targets, and that's what has made the people who are in France now feel particularly vulnerable.
Anna, thank you very much indeed. That's Anna Holligan there, my colleague, just up the road from here at the Bataclan Concert Hall, where 89 people lost their lives. Well, the attacks here in Paris inevitably have been top of the agenda at the G20 summit of world leaders in Turkey. We can go to Vicky Young, our correspondent covering the summit. And Vicky, we're just hearing actually that there is a new video put out by so-called Islamic State warning that other countries taking part in airstrikes against Islamic State will suffer the same fate as France and Paris. Obviously trying to milk the attacks here for propaganda value, but what has been the mood there at the G20 summit, and to what extent are world leaders, do you think, perhaps a little more united than they were on how to deal with this threat of Islamic State?
Well, I think from what you say there, they are united in many ways, aren't they, by being under threat from ISIL and these attacks. And it will come as no surprise to people in Britain, to the politicians, to the security services, that they are threatening further atrocities. David Cameron today revealed that the UK intelligence services had thwarted plots 7 in the last year, and indications are that one might have been thwarted pretty recently. What's been going on here is there's been a concerted effort by leaders to talk to President Putin, try and persuade him that they have a common enemy in ISIL and they can join together to try and defeat that organisation. And of course, around all that, it's some kind of process in Syria, some kind of political process to get through all of this. Today, David Cameron had his first face-to-face meeting with President Putin for a year. I mean, it was interesting. Right at the beginning, there were some words from the two leaders. President Putin saying that relations with the UK had not been living through the best of times, although he said that there had been some recovery. Downing Street officials say they had constructive and measured discussions. There's been a lot of talk about bridging the gap between them, but finding an agreement, certainly on what happens to President Assad, I think will still be an issue. But a lot of talk about momentum in all of this process. David Cameron then held a press conference. I asked him, wasn't there a certain irony, and wasn't he embarrassed in some way that while he is saying to President Putin, you've got to concentrate more fire on ISIL in Syria, he can't even take part in that because his parliament won't authorise it?
Well, we've taken action against ISIL in Iraq, and we've been one of the biggest contributors to that, and we've enabled what's happened in Syria. You know, it's our air-to-air refueling, our intelligence, the way we work with our partners that's made some of these things possible. And where we've needed to take sovereign domestic action to keep ourselves safe, as we did in the case of Khan Hussein in Syria, we've done exactly that. I think there is a very strong case for saying ISIL doesn't stop at the Iraq-Syria border, and therefore neither should we. But I recognise I need to do more to build this argument, to build this case, to take Parliament with me.
So really, David Cameron there admitting that he wasn't being able to persuade people, some in the opposition, of course, Labour MPs, but also some on his own side who just think that the UK getting involved in airstrikes in Syria is not the right thing to do unless you've got this broader political process going on alongside it.
Vicky, thank you very much indeed, Vicky Young there. Well, the attacks here in France have really underlined the enormous challenge there is for the French intelligence services and security services, also what we've been seeing in Brussels for the Belgian intelligence services. And David Cameron and the British government have been indicating that a number of plots have been foiled just in the last few months.
Countering ISIS and not the moderate Syrian opposition. And Mr. Cameron's thinking seems to be that if he can get some sort of diplomatic deal with Putin, then that will make it easier for him to get another vote in the House of Commons on Britain joining in airstrikes, this time perhaps being better placed to win it. Well, joining me is the former Conservative Defence Secretary, Liam Fox. I mean, how likely do you think is the prospect of another vote on airstrikes in Syria?
Well, I think it's not a necessarily military decision, but it's a political one. And talking to people in other parts of the world, they wonder why Britain is not taking part in this particular coalition. They find it odd. And I think it does damage Britain's reputation. So the quicker we can get in line with the other countries who are bombing ISIS in Syria, the better. But I think we should also understand the limitations of that. It's not going to be a panacea. We're not going to be able to destroy ISIS purely from the air. And it is going to require coordination on the ground at some point and in some form.
Constitutionally, the Prime Minister could order airstrikes without a parliamentary vote. Do you think he should do that?
Well, I've always argued, including in the Commons, that if it's necessary for our national security, the government should act and then explain it to Parliament. But we seem to have developed this convention really since the Iraq war that Parliament needs to be consulted before we take military action. I don't believe that's constitutionally correct. I don't think it's necessary, but it seems to be the case.
Thanks very much for your time there. Of course, that coalition included American and, yes, British troops on the ground. Ben, we will hear more, I think, on the security situation this afternoon in the Commons, where the Home Secretary, Theresa May, will be giving MPs an update on the security situation in the UK.
Norma Smith there, our assistant political editor, with the latest from Westminster. Well, we were hearing a few minutes ago from Anna Holligan, my colleague, just up the road at the Bataclan. Concert Hall, where 89 people lost their lives when the 4 gunmen stormed in and began shooting people systematically. The horror that unfolded in there on Friday night. There was a minute's silence impeccably observed at the Bataclan earlier on today, as there was indeed across France and across Europe. But our colleague Graham Satchell has been talking to one of the survivors who was in the Bataclan when the gunmen opened fire, and
all around me. They tell people in the crowd to not move or they shout. I thought I will die this night. And I couldn't move. If I had moved, I would have been killed. I don't know why I'm still alive today. I don't know.
As Samuel lay trapped on the floor, others managed to escape. Many were injured. This woman clinging perilously to a window ledge. Samuel thinks he may have been spared because he was partially covered by a woman who'd been injured.
The girl next to mine has been shot. I don't know if she's living now or she's dead. I hope she was just injured.
Outside the Bataclan, French police are desperately trying to get in, but are shot at by the terrorists. Eventually, they stormed the building.
We heard a lot of noise, and I saw a lot of policemen with protections telling you can go now. And I looked all around me, and I saw all that people. That was blood red on the floor. A lot of people were, I imagine, dead, and other injured.
The full horrors of what happened on Friday night have yet to fully sink in. Samuel has struggled to sleep, struggled to understand.
We are in a free country. I love democracy. I believe in human rights. I believe in freedom. I want equality between women and men. I don't know why people think different.
89 people were killed at the Bataclan, an atrocity that has changed Samuel, that has changed France. Graham Satchell, BBC News, Paris.
Well, now we've been bringing you 26-year-old Salah Abdeslam. We haven't had it confirmed yet whether he has or had not been arrested. Certainly there were early reports that he had been arrested. That came to us from RTL Media in Belgium. But that was then denied, according to Belgian television, by the prosecutor's office. So some confusion, but that seems to be what this operation in Montenbeek is all about, is trying to track down and detain 26-year-old Salah Abdeslam, one of 3 brothers who were an integral part of this conspiracy and this wave of attacks here in Paris. Well, now, today, one of the days of national mourning that were declared across France, people have stopped what they're doing. And observed a minute's silence, not just here in Paris, but right across France and indeed across Europe. And it was impeccably observed, a minute's silence for the 120.
Severe weather has already had its impacts across parts of the country. These are the scenes from West Yorkshire. The floodwaters gradually receding at the moment, but there's further heavy rain to come. However, that's not all. We've got some potentially very damaging winds for tomorrow night in particular as Storm Barney arrives. And then as we end the week, a transformation. Cold Arctic air sinking southwards, and that could have its impacts as well. Back to the here and now, very strong winds across the far northwest of Scotland, gusts of 60 or 70 miles an hour. It'll turn increasingly wet across the far north as well. Some wintry showers for the Highlands and the grand start to the day. In fact, the northern half of Scotland probably stays bright, though cold. Rain sweeps in across England and Wales, Northern Ireland, the southern half of Scotland. Yes, it gets hooked up across parts of northern England, so we'll keep a very close eye on that. Mild to the south, chilly to the north. Temperatures here, 6s and 7s. But tomorrow night, we're increasingly concerned about the potential for Barney to give some, destructive winds. 70, 80 miles an hour around exposed coasts of Wales and southern England. Even inland, we could see gusts of 60. or 70 miles an hour. That's certainly enough to give some significant disruption. So
just across the bridge behind me, that's Germany for what they hope will be the very beginning of a new life.
They're backing up at every border, desperate to get on the buses to try to keep on moving forwards.
The BBC News Channel, breaking news, developing stories. Discover how World War I changed your world. Uncover amazing stories about the people and places where you live.
Join me for a world exclusive Adele at the BBC, Friday, 8:30 on BBC One.
Hello, you. Watching BBC News with Joanna Gosling. An update on our main news at 12:30. There is a big police operation underway in Brussels. Police are searching for one of the key suspects in the Paris attacks. The Belgian public state broadcaster has denied reports that 26-year-old Saleh Abdeslam has been detained. There are also reports that this man, Abdelhamid Abaoud from Belgium, masterminded the attacks on the French capital. It's thought he lived in the same neighbourhood of Brussels as two of the attackers and is based in Syria. A minute's silence has been observed in France and across Europe to remember the 129 people killed in the Paris terror attacks. World leaders meeting in Turkey for the G20 summit also honoured the victims. This is the scene live in Molenbeek in Brussels, where there is a police raid underway. The pictures that we are showing you are on a 1-minute delay. The security services there have been quite sensitive about the operation underway as they reportedly try to track down Saleh Abdeslam, who is one of those who has been named by the French police as a key suspect in the Paris attacks. There have been some reports saying that he is in a house surrounded by police. There has been released without any charges, and a third brother was also involved in the Paris attacks. Let me also bring you some reports that we're getting about explosions being heard
in the area. 2 small explosions reportedly heard in this area. There were reports earlier from Belgian news agencies that there had been gunfire and some small explosions heard, but it was not something that BBC reporters could confirm. There was no other confirmation of it, but we are able to tell you that there are reports that there have been 2 minor explosions. There you can see the map just in the bottom of the screen, which shows you Paris. Actually, I thought it was a map showing Belgium, but and where these raids are happening. But it was not that. There have been 150 raids overnight. So many developments after those attacks in Paris on Friday, including these raids underway right now in Brussels and many other police raids. 100 140 raids over.
Came through about an hour or so ago now. It follows 2 days of deliberations at the end of a month-long trial. Nigel Barwell and Thomas O'Reilly are brothers-in-law. They're both 51 years old, and they were actually arrested within a couple of days of Nicola Payne's disappearance back in 1991. They were rearrested in 2013 and then charged earlier this year with her murder. They've stood trial here. They've always denied being involved in her disappearance. And as the verdicts were read out, Nigel Barwell actually thanked the jury, and there were some tears from his friends and relatives who had been sitting in the public gallery. John Payne, Nicola Payne's father, sat just staring blankly ahead with his head bowed, really, as those verdicts were read out. As you say, Nicola disappeared on December the 14th, 1991. She had a 7-month-old son, Owen. He's now nearly 25. He came to court here on Friday to support his grandmother and his grandfather, who have helped to bring him up, along with Nicola's then boyfriend, Jason Cook, from 24 years ago. She disappeared into the fog across some waste ground, walking between the 2 houses. It should have been a journey that took about 5 or 10 minutes. She was never seen alive again. There was an alarm raised almost immediately, a massive search of that particular area of waste ground known as the Black Pad, and since then there have been repeated appeals for information, further extensive searches, excavations, in the hope that at some stage they would be able to put this mystery to an end. Now, I spoke to John and Marilyn last week before the jury came back, just to talk to them about how they felt 24 years on. It's been very difficult for them, as you can imagine. They've often held out hope that at some stage they will get the answers that they're so desperate for. And I know that they will want people out there, anybody with information who maybe has been afraid to come forward in the past, still to come forward. We've just had a statement from West Midlands Police. They say they still regard this as an active investigation. They will be reiterating those appeals, no doubt, on the anniversary of Nicola Payne's disappearance yet again, to say that they are still determined to find Nicola Payne's killer or killers, and of course the Payne family.
To counter the extremist ideology and the terrorists' propaganda, and to better protect ourselves from the threat of foreign fighters by sharing intelligence and stopping them from travelling. Importantly, for the first time ever, we've also agreed to work to strengthen global aviation security together. Almost 80% of all air travel worldwide is undertaken by citizens from G20 countries, so it's in all our interest to take action to do all we can to keep it safe. We need robust and consistent standards of aviation security in every airport in the world, and we must provide technical and financial assistance to countries with particularly vulnerable locations. The UK will at least double its spending on aviation security this Parliament to ensure we can help tighten security worldwide. On Syria, it is vital that we do more to help those in desperate humanitarian need, that we find a political solution to this conflict, and that we degrade and destroy ISIL. Britain is already the second largest contributor to the humanitarian crisis, providing £1.1 billion in vital life-saving assistance. Last week we committed a further £275 million to be spent here in Turkey, a country hosting over 2 million refugees. Today I can announce that together with leaders of Germany, Norway, Kuwait and the United Nations, I will co-host a Syria Donors Conference in London early next year to raise significant new funding. But none of this is a substitute for the most urgent need of all, to find a political solution that brings peace to Syria and enables the millions of refugees to return home. This morning I held talks with President Putin, and I urged him to work with the international community to support a transition in Syria away from President Assad and his ruthless brutality. We need to find a way to work together to bring this fighting to an end and to focus on the aim we all share, destroying the evil death cult which is ISIL. That means continuing our efforts to degrade and destroy ISIL in Syria and Iraq. Together, coalition forces have damaged over 13,500 targets. We've helped local forces to regain 30% of ISIL territory in Iraq, retake Kobane and push ISIL back towards Raqqa. On Friday, Kurdish forces retook Sinjar. The UK is playing its part, training local forces, striking targets in Iraq and providing vital intelligence support. And seamless cooperation between the UK and the US is delivering results, as the strike against Emwazi showed last week.
David Cameron in Turkey at the G20 summit. Well, our correspondent Ian Pannell is in Molenbeek in Brussels, where a major police raid has been taking place. He sent us this update.
We're in the Brussels forces, not only to watch what's going on in this area, but to be able to stop it.
Well, let's just show you the pictures that we have from Molenbeek right now. They're actually running on a delay because the authorities there are very sensitive about the operation currently underway. You can see some of the security people involved in these raids, and there have been raids over the weekend following on from the attacks on Friday night. This very much an area of focus. It is the area where some of those as we watch the raids unfolding in Belgium, have you been surprised by the fact that Belgium has become a focus in this way?
Well, I've not been surprised that this is a kind of cross-border operation.
I think it's interesting that it's Belgium, and people know that in proportionate terms, more Belgian Muslims have gone to be jihadists than any other part of the European Union. So there's a very strong presence of jihadists, people who have gone to fight for the Islamic State and perhaps come back from the Islamic State in Belgium. But I think what we're seeing is these very detailed, important, detailed issues, trying to track people, that an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all NATO countries, and that all NATO countries need to defend the country that's been attacked. In other words, are we beginning to see what could be a concerted NATO attack on the Islamic State in its early stages? So the details, the question of intelligence-led policy, will there be further attacks? The French Prime Minister has said we need to expect further attacks in France, further attacks in other European countries. Security, cross-border security. I mean, it's been appalling that people could travel with carloads of Kalashnikovs from Germany to Belgium, from Belgium to France. Where are they getting these Kalashnikovs from in the first place? And then the big picture. Are we being geared for a massive attack on Syria? That's a big question.
And going back then to what you were saying about NATO, what could that mean for British involvement? Because David Cameron has been speaking again about going back to Parliament, but only if there were consensus for Britain to be involved in operations. Well,
David Cameron's in a very difficult place, of course, and one's got to understand that. He's made it clear that there have been attacks in the United Kingdom. They have gone in Britain. They need to take the public with them. That's the only way you will discover from a cross-border network of jihadists at the same time as you've got many people, hundreds of thousands of people coming into the European Union. We've seen the Syrian passport in the case of one of these terrorists. It's the only way that the immediate threat of further attacks can be thwarted. Borders need to be closed. There needs to be more interception. perception. But that's, of course, still not going to solve the problem of the existence of the Islamic State.
Islamic State is warning in a new video today that any countries taking part in airstrikes against Syria will be attacked, as France has been.
Values of Europe, but on the ability of Europe and European political leaders to provide security for the people of Europe. And if the Islamic State think they can get us on the back foot, that will be a challenge which David Cameron and the other leaders simply can't duck any longer. And yes, we've got a new Labour Party in Britain, led by a pacifist, long-standing pacifist. He was going to speak out against intervention on Saturday, but then that speech was cancelled because of the Paris attacks. There's substantial opposition in the Conservative Party to intervention, but at the end of the day, we are members of NATO. NATO isn't the European Union, and I don't think there are any Conservative Party members who oppose our being members of NATO. NATO says an attack on one is an attack on all and must be sorted, and that's what I'll be looking out to see.
Good to talk to you. Thank you very much, Anthony Cleese. Well, stories of
the bullets. At this point, the band looked very confused. People sort of let out a gasp and they automatically ducked down. And I just said to Christine, "That's gunfire, run, get out of here." And we just ran.
And where did you head to?
We were about 10 feet away from the exit. That would have, if we had gone left, that exit would have.
Was going on in the venue above you?
It was just a stampede and screaming and gunfire.
And of course you wouldn't know if you'd necessarily got to a place of safety because you don't know where the gunmen will go after that.
No, nothing felt safe at that moment in time. We were just, we went to run back out of the...
No, for that second you thought potentially that they were gunmen?
Yes, yeah.
Wow. And how long were you in that cellar for, crouched at the back wall?
We didn't get out of that cellar until 1 a.m.
And how did you know to get out, or did someone come and find you?
We just blood everywhere. So we obviously knew there was people very injured, very close to where we had been hiding.
How do you reflect, Marisha, on what happened and the fact that you managed to escape?
I feel a little bit guilty. There was only 4 of us in that room. There was another room on the other side, I think very similar to us. There was 25 people crammed into it. Luckily, they all managed to escape as well after 2 hours. Was there people out there that could have been in the room with us?
Already some ferry disruption here. It turns increasingly wet across the far north and the Northern Isles as we head into the evening and night. Elsewhere, some bright spells around, some sunshine, bit of a respite from the severe weather across northern England, for example. Some sharp showers, but some lengthy dry spells as well. And further south you go, the milder it is. Again, 14, possibly 15 degrees in the sunshine across parts of the southeast. But a sign of things to come across the far southwest. Half of Scotland as we go through the day. The far north, though, stays largely dry. Relatively mild across the south again, up into the high teens potentially. Chilly air lingering across Scotland and Northern Ireland. Let's concentrate on Barnet. It does look as if we could well see 80-mile-an-hour gusts battering the coasts of Wales and southern England, and inland the potential for 70-mile-an-hour gusts. And those sorts of winds are likely to cause some serious...
Police in France and in Belgium carry out dozens of raids after Friday night's terror attacks here in Paris. French police have searched nearly 170 properties across France. More than 20 people have been arrested. The prime suspect is
investigation is launched after a 16-year-old boy is shot dead in Liverpool.
And in sport, ahead of the friendly with France, England footballers join the rest of the world in observing a minute's silence in remembrance of those killed in the Paris attacks.
The French government says nothing is being left to chance.
Distinctement, ce n'est là qu'un début.
This is just the beginning. These actions will continue. The reply of the Republic will be redoubled and total.
Celui qui s'en prend à la République.
Anyone who hurts the Republic will not escape. Neither will those who have helped them or those who have brainwashed them.
Et ceux qui l'ont endoctriné.
And we now know more about some of the men behind the attacks. Sami Amamour, 28. But normal. It's a city on edge and that's grieving. Pockets of the city have become shrines. But with time, people will be drinking in these very restaurants and bars that were targeted, because that's what Paris wants. Along with the fear, there is that sense of defiance that life has to go on.
My colleague is in the Molenbeek district of Brussels, and Christian, it's really known as a hotbed of Islamist extremism there. It's had links in the past to terror plots. What is going on there?
As once, and now there are frantic efforts to retrace him. And as long as Salah Abdeslam is free, another attack is a serious concern. The investigation has been centred throughout the weekend on this notorious Brussels district of Molenbeek. Today, a huge area of the city was sealed off as a special police unit moved in.
Mais ils étaient en action parce que j'ai vu les policiers arriver.
There was a order early on Saturday morning, and now travelling in a VW Golf, Abdeslam turned up with two other people. Police did question him. They took his name, but he waved on, having produced French ID. Only later did they realise Salah's brother, Brahim, was the gunman who'd blown himself up on Boulevard Voltaire. The Belgian foreign minister says in charge, and the prosecutor said that he has learned after he was released that one of his brothers died in Paris. You were asking about this place, Molenbeek, Ben. It's got a particular problem with the number of fighters that have gone off to fight in Syria, 30 to 35 people from this district alone. In fact, Belgium has a real problem altogether because it's sent more fighters to Syria per capita.
Young people who lost their lives on Friday night. Here in Paris, President Hollande observed the silence at Sorbonne University and at cafes and bars and restaurants in Paris where some of the attacks took place. People gathered to remember the dead. Nicholas Witchell reports.
Je vous invite à observer une minute de silence.
For a city which grieves, a continent paused. Many people in many countries, standing for 1 minute in solidarity with the people of Paris. Likewise, political leaders and people of all faiths and all ages standing in silence. This was a French school in South London. Children, many of whom are too young fully to understand. But then, who can? Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
Well, the biggest loss of life on Friday night was at the Bataclan Concert Hall just down the road from here, where 89 people, many of them young people, lost their lives. Our correspondent Graham Satchell's been talking to one of the survivors who was there